My family got my grief counseling license suspended before my first bereaved parent client. I'm 42 years old, and 3 weeks ago I opened a private grief counseling practice specializing in parents who've lost children. I became a licensed professional counselor 2 months ago after completing a 3-year master's degree program. I started this journey 4 years ago, 6 months after my daughter Sophie died from leukemia at age 9. Sophie's death, after 14 months of treatment, destroyed me. The grief was unbearable, not just losing her, but the specific trauma of watching childhood cancer slowly take her despite every medical intervention. Standard grief counseling helped, but I felt most understood in support groups with other parents who'd lost children. They knew the unique devastation of burying your child. After 2 years of healing, I decided to become a grief counselor specifically for bereaved parents. I enrolled in a counseling master's program, studied trauma and bereavement, completed 600 clinical hours, passed licensing exams. My specialty would be parents grieving child loss. I'd use my experience to help others navigate the impossible grief I knew intimately. My husband, Eric, 44, and our son, Dylan, 14, have been opposed to my counseling practice from the start. Eric thinks working with grieving parents will keep me stuck in Sophie's death. Dylan says knowing I spend all day with people whose children died makes him feel like I'm choosing dead kids over him. I explained, this work honors Sophie's memory by helping parents survive the grief that almost killed me, but they see it as unhealthy obsession. Last week I got my first client, Jennifer, whose 7-year-old son died in a drowning accident 2 months ago. She'd specifically sought out a counselor who'd experienced child loss. Our first session was scheduled for yesterday. Then the licensing board called. Anonymous complaints alleged I was exploiting grieving parents and practicing without maintaining professional boundaries. My license was suspended pending investigation. Jennifer's appointment was canceled. Eric admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting vulnerable people from my unprocessed grief. When Eric admitted filing complaints with the licensing board, he defended it as preventing me from using other people's dead children to avoid dealing with Sophie's death. He claimed watching me prepare for Jennifer's session had made him realize I wasn't emotionally ready to counsel bereaved parents. I asked how he could assess my clinical readiness when my licensing supervisors had evaluated and approved me. Eric said those supervisors didn't live with me and couldn't see how much I still struggled with Sophie's death privately. When I pointed out I'd completed years of training specifically preparing me to work with bereaved parents while managing my own grief, Eric said the training was theoretical, and that facing my first real client whose child had died would trigger a breakdown. Dylan admitted he'd encouraged Eric's decision. He said knowing my first client was a mother whose son drowned made him imagine Sophie dying, and he'd been terrified I'd come home from the session destroyed. Jennifer, my first client, was reassigned to a different counselor. I called her to apologize for the cancellation, and she was gracious but clearly disappointed. She'd waited 3 weeks for our appointment after specifically requesting a counselor who'd lost a child. The licensing board investigated thoroughly. I provided documentation, my clinical supervision records showing appropriate grief processing, my licensing exam scores, statements from my master's program supervisors confirming my fitness to practice. They reinstated my license within 72 hours, confirming Eric's allegations were baseless. But Jennifer had already started with the other counselor and didn't want to switch mid-treatment. I told Eric I wanted a divorce. He said I was overreacting and proving grief counseling had become more important than family. Dylan said he was glad Jennifer got a different counselor because he'd been anxious about me working with her. My clinical supervisor, who'd overseen my training, was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a formal statement supporting my fitness to practice and condemning Eric's interference as sabotage of professional mental health services. The other counselor who'd taken Jennifer as a client sent me a private message. She said Jennifer had mentioned being disappointed about switching counselors because she'd wanted someone who'd experienced child loss personally. That's what Eric had stolen. Jennifer's opportunity to work with a counselor who truly understood her specific grief. It's been 2 weeks since Eric got my first client's session canceled. We're separated, and he's staying with his brother. He maintains he saved vulnerable people from my unprocessed grief. I've since taken on 3 bereaved parent clients. A father whose teenage daughter died by suicide, a couple whose infant died from SIDS, and a mother whose son died from brain cancer. All 3 sessions have gone well, and my clinical supervisor says I'm maintaining excellent professional boundaries while using my personal experience appropriately. Dylan has started therapy and is working through his anxiety about my grief counseling work. His therapist says Dylan's fear that I'll love dead children more than him stems from unprocessed grief about losing Sophie. We're addressing it together. Eric sent me articles about compassion fatigue in grief counselors, claiming they prove working with bereaved parents will eventually destroy me. He doesn't understand that helping others survive child loss helps me find meaning in Sophie's death. My licensing board flagged Eric's complaints as malicious interference with professional practice, and noted that filing false allegations wastes investigative resources needed for legitimate concerns. Jennifer completed 6 sessions with the other counselor and is doing better, according to mutual professional contacts. I'm glad she got help, but I'll always wonder if having a counselor who'd lost a child would have made her healing easier. Some people think I should forgive Eric since he claims he was worried about my mental health. But worry doesn't justify filing false licensing complaints that suspended my practice and cost my first client the specific type of counselor she'd sought. I'm 42, a licensed grief counselor specializing in child loss, separated from the husband who sabotaged my first bereaved parent client, and building a practice helping parents survive the grief that almost killed me. Every client I help proves Eric wrong. Every parent I guide through impossible grief demonstrates that Sophie's death makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. Jennifer should have been my first client. Eric made sure she wasn't, but he couldn't stop me from helping the parents who came after her. That's my revenge. Succeeding at work he tried to destroy. Proving my loss of Sophie gives me insight that helps other grieving parents, and building a practice from the worst experience of my life. Sophie died from leukemia at age 9. I'm making sure other parents who lose children have support from someone who knows exactly what they're experiencing. Eric tried to stop that. He failed. And every bereaved parent I counsel is proof he couldn't permanently sabotage my calling to turn devastating loss into helping others survive their own. My family got me removed as a CASA volunteer right before my first child's court hearing. I'm 40 years old, and 3 months ago I became a certified CASA volunteer, court-appointed special advocate for foster children. CASAs are trained volunteers appointed by judges to advocate for abused and neglected children in the foster care system. I complete home visits, investigate circumstances, interview family members, and make recommendations to the court about what's in the child's best interest. I started CASA training 2 years ago, 18 months after my daughter Emma was removed by CPS following false abuse allegations made by my ex-husband Greg during our custody battle. The investigation cleared me completely, but Emma spent 3 terrifying weeks in foster care before being returned. Those weeks watching my daughter navigate a system designed to protect her, but that felt like punishment, showed me how crucial advocacy is for children caught in that system. After Emma came home and our custody was finalized in my favor, I wanted to help other children who didn't have someone fighting for them. CASA training took 9 months, 40 hours of classroom instruction on child welfare law, trauma-informed advocacy, court procedures, plus supervised case shadowing. Last month I was certified and assigned my first case. David is 8 years old, removed from his parents due to neglect, currently in his 3rd foster home in 6 months. His court hearing is tomorrow, a critical hearing determining whether he returns home or moves toward adoption. I've spent 3 months investigating, visiting David weekly, building trust, preparing my recommendation for the judge. My boyfriend Ryan, 42, and my daughter Emma, now 11, have been unsupportive of my CASA work. Ryan thinks working with foster children re-traumatizes me about Emma's removal. Emma says hearing about other kids in foster care makes her remember her own experience. Yesterday, CASA called. Anonymous complaints claimed I had conflict of interest due to my own CPS history and was projecting personal trauma onto my case. My court testimony privileges were suspended pending investigation. David's hearing is tomorrow, and I won't be there to advocate for him. Ryan admitted he filed the complaints, saying he was protecting vulnerable children from my bias. When Ryan admitted filing complaints about my CASA certification, he said he'd been genuinely worried that my experience with Emma's removal made me too emotionally involved to objectively advocate for foster children. He claimed I'd been projecting anger at CPS onto David's case instead of evaluating it fairly. I asked how he could assess my casework when he'd never reviewed my reports or attended my home visits. Ryan said he'd read my notes. I keep case files at home per CASA protocol. When I was out and had decided my recommendations were influenced by resentment rather than David's actual best interests. He'd violated confidentiality by reading sealed case files, then used that stolen information to file false complaints, destroying my ability to testify at tomorrow's hearing. Emma admitted she'd encouraged Ryan to report me. She said hearing me discuss David's case triggered memories of her own foster care experience, and she'd wanted the CASA work to stop. I explained that David had been preparing for tomorrow's hearing, knowing I'd be there to speak for him. An 8-year-old who'd been in 3 homes in 6 months finally had a consistent advocate, and now I wouldn't be at his hearing because Ryan decided my personal history disqualified me. The CASA director was sympathetic but firm. Once allegations about volunteer fitness were filed, they couldn't allow court testimony until investigation concluded. David would have the judge's standard report, but no dedicated advocate testimony. I'd spent 3 months building David's trust, investigating his case, preparing recommendations. Tomorrow, a judge would decide his future without hearing from the person who'd spent the most time understanding his needs. Ryan said the CASA program would assign someone objective to David. I told him 3 months of relationship building couldn't be transferred overnight, that David had opened up to me specifically, that my recommendations were based on extensive case investigation. I told Ryan to leave. He said I was overreacting and proving CASA work had become emotionally unhealthy. Emma was upset seeing me end a relationship over volunteer work. The CASA director fast-tracked my investigation. Within 24 hours, they reviewed my case files, interviewed my supervisor, and confirmed my recommendations were professionally sound and evidence-based, not trauma-influenced. But the investigation cleared me 12 hours too late. David's hearing happened this morning without my testimony. The judge made decisions based on incomplete information because my advocacy was removed at the last minute. It's been 1 week since Ryan got me removed from David's court hearing. The investigation cleared me and reinstated my court testimony privileges, but the damage was done. The judge ruled based on limited information, and David is being moved to a 4th foster home while reunification services continue. I attended David's next visit and tried to explain why I wasn't at his hearing. He's 8 years old and doesn't understand investigative procedures. He just knows the person he trusted to speak for him wasn't there when it mattered most. Ryan maintains he did the right thing by reporting concerns about my objectivity. He sent me research about secondary trauma in advocacy work, claiming it proves my CPS history makes me unsuitable for CASA volunteering. He doesn't understand that my experience makes me better at this work, not worse. Emma has apologized. She's started therapy to process her foster care trauma properly, instead of asking me to stop advocacy work that triggers her memories. The CASA director assigned me a new case, a sibling group that needs advocacy. But David's situation haunts me. My recommendations about his placement and services weren't heard because Ryan decided my personal history disqualified me from speaking. Some people think I should forgive Ryan since he claims he was protecting vulnerable children. But he wasn't protecting anyone. He violated confidentiality, filed false complaints, and prevented an 8-year-old from having dedicated advocacy at a critical hearing. I'm 40, a certified CASA volunteer, single after ending it with Ryan, and continuing to advocate for foster children despite his attempt to end my work. Every case I take proves Ryan failed to stop me. Every child I advocate for is evidence that my CPS history makes me more effective, not less qualified. David deserved my testimony at his hearing. Ryan made sure he didn't get it. That's what I have to live with. Knowing a child I'd built trust with faced a life-changing court decision without my voice because my boyfriend sabotaged my advocacy work. The CASA work continues. Ryan is gone, and I'm proving every day that personal trauma can fuel powerful, effective advocacy for children who need someone fighting for them.
My family got me decertified as a climbing instructor before my first guided ascent. I'm 41 years old, and 2 months ago, I became a certified rock climbing instructor after 18 months of intensive training. I started climbing 3 years ago, 1 year after my husband, Nathan, fell from a ladder while cleaning gutters and died from his injuries. Nathan's death from a preventable fall left me with severe acrophobia. I couldn't climb stairs without panic attacks, couldn't look out upper floor windows, couldn't function normally around heights. Therapy helped, but my psychologist suggested exposure therapy through controlled climbing. I joined an indoor climbing gym, started with walls barely off the ground, gradually worked up to higher climbs. Something unexpected happened. I fell in love with climbing. The precise movements, the problem-solving, the community of climbers supporting each other. Climbing gave me back control over the fear that had paralyzed me after Nathan's death. Over 3 years, I progressed from beginner to advanced climber to instructor certification. I completed wilderness first responder training, learned advanced safety systems, studied teaching methodologies. Last month, I passed my final certification to lead outdoor climbing expeditions. My teenage children, Zoe, 17, and Miles, 15, have been hostile about my climbing. Zoe thinks I'm replacing Dad with a dangerous hobby. Miles says climbing is tempting fate after Nathan died from falling. Both have accused me of being obsessed and reckless. Last week I was scheduled to lead my first guided climb, taking 4 clients up a popular local crag. My certification meant everything, proof I'd transformed paralyzing fear into professional expertise. Then, the climbing organization called. Anonymous complaints claimed I'd falsified my safety training and was mentally unstable due to my husband's death. My certification was suspended. Zoe admitted she'd filed the complaints, saying she was protecting people from your death wish. She'd sabotaged my first professional climb because she couldn't accept I'd turned Nathan's death into conquering the exact fear that had destroyed me. When Zoe admitted filing false complaints about my climbing certification, she justified it as keeping you alive. She said watching me climb was torture because she kept imagining me falling like Nathan, and she'd decided getting my certification revoked would force me to stop taking risks. I asked how she could sabotage work I'd trained 18 months for. Zoe said climbing instruction was basically a suicide job, and she'd rather I hate her than watch me die doing something stupid. Miles admitted he'd supported Zoe's plan. He said he'd been having nightmares about me falling every time I went climbing, and thought getting me decertified would make the nightmares stop. I explained climbing instruction is extensively safety-focused, that I'd completed wilderness first responder training specifically to handle emergencies, that my fear of heights made me more cautious and safety-conscious than most instructors. Zoe said none of that mattered because
Dad was being safe too, and he still died. She'd decided any activity involving heights was unacceptably dangerous, regardless of safety protocols. The climbing organization investigated thoroughly. I provided documentation of all my training, certifications from safety courses, testimonials from instructors who'd supervised my teaching practice. They confirmed Zoe's allegations were baseless, but said they needed 2 weeks to complete the review process. My first guided climb was canceled, and the clients rebooked with another instructor. I'd lost my debut as a professional guide because my daughter had filed false safety complaints. I told Zoe and Miles they'd betrayed me by sabotaging work that represented conquering the fear Nathan's death had created. Zoe said climbing was spitting on Dad's grave, and she'd do it again. I'm staying with my sister while deciding next steps. Zoe is unrepentant. Miles is beginning to understand the climbing certification represented healing, not disrespecting his father. My climbing certification was reinstated after the investigation confirmed Zoe's complaints were fabricated. But the first guided climb, the achievement I'd worked toward for 18 months, was gone. I have new climbs scheduled, but knowing my own daughter sabotaged my professional debut because she couldn't accept I'd transformed Nathan's tragic fall into mastering heights has damaged our relationship beyond easy repair. It's been 4 weeks since Zoe got my first guided climb canceled. My certification is reinstated, and I've successfully led 3 climbing expeditions. Each time I guide clients safely up and down rock faces, I prove Zoe's fears were unfounded. Zoe remains convinced I'm being reckless. She sent me statistics about climbing accidents, claiming they prove the sport is too dangerous. She doesn't understand that climbing instruction involves extensive safety systems specifically designed to prevent the kind of preventable fall that killed Nathan. Miles has apologized and asked to try climbing himself. He says he wants to understand why it matters to me. I've taken him to the indoor gym twice, and he's starting to see climbing as therapeutic challenge rather than dangerous obsession. My therapist says Zoe's opposition to my climbing represents her own unprocessed trauma around Nathan's death. She's fixated on preventing another loss by controlling my activities, not recognizing that my climbing represents healthy recovery from paralyzing fear. The climbing organization has been supportive, noting that my personal experience with acrophobia makes me especially empathetic with nervous clients. Several people I've guided have said my story of conquering fear after losing my husband inspired them. Some people think I should understand Zoe's fear-driven sabotage. But understanding doesn't mean accepting. She filed false safety complaints that got my certification temporarily suspended and cost me my first professional climb. I'm 41, a certified climbing instructor, and I've successfully guided multiple expeditions despite my daughter's attempt to end my career before it started. Each climb I lead is proof that Nathan's death didn't have to define me with permanent fear. Conquering heights professionally honors his memory better than avoiding them would. Zoe can't see that yet. Maybe she never will. But I'm not stopping climbing instruction because my teenage daughter decided it's too dangerous. Nathan died from a preventable accident on a ladder. I've become a professional at preventing climbing accidents through proper safety systems. That's not disrespecting his memory. It's transforming tragedy into expertise that keeps people safe. Zoe tried to stop me. She failed, and I'm still climbing. My family got my tattoo studio shut down before my mental health recovery charity event. I'm 38 years old, and 6 months ago, I opened my own tattoo studio, specializing in scar cover-ups and mental health recovery artwork. I became a licensed tattoo artist 4 years ago, 5 years after I attempted suicide and survived. That suicide attempt left scars on my wrists that I struggled with daily, visible reminders of my darkest moment that I couldn't hide. 2 years into recovery, I met a tattoo artist who specialized in transforming scars into beautiful art. She covered my suicide attempt scars with intricate floral designs that made me cry with relief. For the first time since my attempt, I could look at my wrists without shame. That experience changed my perspective. If tattoo art could transform my relationship with my scars, maybe I could provide that healing for others. I spent 4 years apprenticing, studying tattoo technique, learning skin biology and scar tissue coverage, getting properly licensed and certified in blood-borne pathogen safety. Last year I opened Phoenix Inc., a studio focused on helping people with self-harm scars, surgery scars, and trauma-related scarring transform those marks into meaningful art. The work is deeply personal. Most clients cry during consultations when they see design options that could turn their pain into beauty. I understand their shame, their triggers, their need for control over bodies that bear marks of suffering. My own recovery story helps clients trust me with their scars. My husband Todd, 40, and our teenagers Jasmine, 16, and Connor, 14, have been uncomfortable with my tattoo work from the start. Todd thinks running a shop focused on mental health scars is dwelling on my suicide attempt, rather than moving past it. Jasmine says explaining her mom is a tattoo artist who works with cutters is embarrassing. Connor worries I'll relapse from constant exposure to other people's self-harm stories.
3 months ago, I organized Recovery Ink Day, a charity event where my studio would provide free scar cover-up tattoos for suicide attempt and self-harm survivors who couldn't afford the work. I'd partnered with mental health organizations, lined up 20 clients, recruited volunteer artists. The event was scheduled for yesterday. Last week, the health department showed up for an emergency inspection following multiple serious complaints about sanitation and safety violations at my studio. They found nothing wrong, but regulations required closing the shop pending full investigation completion. Recovery Ink Day had to be canceled. 20 survivors who'd been scheduled for free scar cover-ups were turned away. Todd admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting vulnerable people from my unhealthy focus on self-harm. When Todd admitted filing false health code violations with the health department, he justified it as preventing mentally unstable people from congregating at my studio. He'd decided Recovery Ink Day was dangerous. Putting suicide attempt survivors together might trigger relapses, and I'd be responsible for any self-harm that resulted. I asked how he could sabotage an event meant to help people heal from trauma. Todd said tattoo cover-ups don't address underlying mental health issues, and I was offering cosmetic fixes to people who needed therapy, not ink. When I explained that every Recovery Ink Day client was required to submit proof of at least 6 months in stable recovery and a therapist's clearance letter, Todd said those safeguards weren't enough, and that my suicide attempt history meant I couldn't objectively assess safety. Jasmine and Connor admitted they'd encouraged Todd to stop the event. Jasmine said having her mom host an event for people who cut themselves was too much, and she'd been dreading explaining it to friends. Connor said being around reminders of my suicide attempt made him anxious. The health department investigation cleared my studio within 72 hours. Every sanitation protocol was properly followed, all licensing current, 0 violations found. But Recovery Ink Day had already been canceled, and rescheduling meant disappointing clients who'd cleared schedules and built up courage to get their scars covered. One client, a 23-year-old woman with extensive forearm scars from years of self-harm, sent me a heartbreaking message. She'd been clean for 18 months, had saved for therapy, and was ready to transform her scars. She'd taken time off work, told her family, prepared mentally for the tattoo session. The cancellation devastated her. I told Todd I wanted a divorce. He said I was overreacting and proving my obsession with suicide recovery was unhealthy. Jasmine said I was choosing tattooing over family. Connor said maybe the cancellation was a sign I should find different work. None of them understood that Recovery Ink Day wasn't about tattooing. It was about giving people control over their bodies,
transforming shame into art, helping survivors reclaim skin that bore marks of suffering. The mental health organizations I'd partnered with were supportive, helping me reschedule Recovery Inc. Day for next month. But the momentum was damaged. Some original clients couldn't make the new date, and others were hesitant after the sudden cancellation. Todd moved out. Jasmine is staying with him, refusing to speak to me. Connor is conflicted, starting to understand the work matters but hurt about the separation. My tattoo mentor, who'd covered my own scars years ago, called the false complaints cruel interference with healing work. Several Phoenix Inc. clients wrote testimonials about how scar cover-up tattoos had transformed their recovery, helping me explain to the health department why the false reports were so damaging. It's been 1 month since Todd got Recovery Inc. Day canceled. The rescheduled event happened last weekend. I provided free scar cover-up tattoos for 15 of the original 20 clients. 5 couldn't make the new date due to scheduling conflicts, losing their opportunity because Todd's false complaints forced the cancellation. The event was powerful. Every client who walked out with fresh tattoos covering their scars cried, some from relief, some from joy, all from the transformative experience of seeing marks of pain turned into deliberate art. One woman told me, "I can finally wear short sleeves without shame." That's what Todd tried to prevent, people reclaiming their bodies from trauma. He decided my recovery work was glorifying self-harm and filed false health violations to shut it down. Jasmine has started therapy and is beginning to understand my tattoo work represents healing, not dwelling on darkness. She attended the rescheduled Recovery Inc. Day and watched clients transform their scars. She apologized afterward, saying she hadn't understood how meaningful the work was. Connor has been learning about suicide prevention and mental health advocacy. He says he's proud of me now, though he's still processing the separation. Todd maintains he did the right thing by stopping the original event. He sent me articles about suicide contagion and trigger risks, claiming they prove bringing self-harm survivors together is dangerous. He doesn't understand that Recovery Inc. Day included mental health professionals on site, crisis resources available, and strict screening for client stability. The health department flagged Todd's complaints as malicious false reporting and noted that wasting inspection resources on fabricated violations diverts staff from legitimate safety concerns. Some people think I should forgive Todd since he claims he was protecting vulnerable people. But he wasn't protecting anyone. He filed false reports because he was embarrassed by my suicide attempt history and didn't want me working with other survivors. I'm 38, a licensed tattoo artist specializing in scar cover-ups, separated from the husband who tried to shut down my studio, and planning next year's Recovery Inc. Day, where I'll help even more survivors transform their scars. The 5 clients who missed the rescheduled event due to Todd's interference have been offered priority slots for next year. They'll get their cover-ups eventually, just months later than planned, because my husband decided my recovery work was too controversial. Every scar I transform into art is proof Todd failed to stop me. Every client who leaves my studio with renewed confidence in their appearance is evidence that this work matters. Phoenix Inc. continues. Recovery events continue, and I continue helping people reclaim bodies marked by pain, doing exactly what Todd tried to prevent. That's my revenge. Succeeding at work he found embarrassing, helping survivors despite his interference, proving that suicide attempt history makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. The tattoos I create help people heal. Todd's false reports couldn't stop that permanently. And I'm at peace, knowing I'm building a career from the darkest moment of my life, turning my survival into helping others survive and thrive. That's what matters. Not Todd's discomfort, not Jasmine's embarrassment, just the work, the healing, and the survivors who walk out of my studio finally comfortable in their own skin. My family got me removed from mediation before my first high-conflict custody case. I'm 40 years old, and last month I became a certified family mediator, specializing in high-conflict divorce and custody disputes. I started this path 3 years ago, 6 months after my own brutal divorce from my ex-husband Keith ended in a devastating custody battle over our sons. The family court process was traumatic. Adversarial attorneys, hostile depositions, our children used as weapons, thousands spent on litigation that destroyed any remaining goodwill between us. Our custody case took 18 months and left both Keith and me emotionally and financially drained. The judge's final order satisfied neither of us, and our sons suffered watching their parents fight in court. After it ended, I wished desperately that we'd tried mediation, a collaborative process where a neutral third party helps divorcing couples reach agreements without courtroom battles. I decided to become that neutral third party for other families. I completed 200 hours of mediation training, studied conflict resolution and child development, practiced with supervised cases, passed certification exams. My specialty would be high-conflict custody disputes, helping parents avoid the courtroom trauma Keith and I had inflicted on our family. My current husband, Glenn, 43, and our blended family have been opposed to my mediation work. Glenn thinks helping divorcing couples will keep me bitter about my own divorce. My sons, Ethan, 14, and Noah, 12, say knowing I spend days with people fighting like you and Dad did makes them remember our custody battle. Last week, I was assigned my first major case. Parents locked in a custody dispute over their 6-year-old daughter, scheduled for trial in 2 weeks. Both attorneys agreed to try mediation first. The session was scheduled for yesterday. 6 hours of facilitated negotiation to help this family avoid court. Then the mediation center director called. They'd received complaints alleging I had unresolved anger from my own divorce that would bias my mediation. My certification privileges were suspended pending review. The custody mediation was canceled, and the family proceeded to trial. Glenn admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting vulnerable families from my bitterness. He'd sabotaged my first chance to help parents avoid the courtroom nightmare I'd experienced. When Glenn admitted filing complaints with the mediation center, he defended it as preventing me from imposing my divorce trauma on clients. He claimed watching me prepare for the custody mediation had made him realize I was still angry at Keith and would be biased against fathers in custody disputes. I asked how he could assess my mediation neutrality when my training supervisors had specifically evaluated my ability to remain impartial despite personal experience. Glenn said those supervisors hadn't lived through my divorce and didn't know how bitter I'd been during the custody battle. When I pointed out my mediation training included extensive work on managing personal triggers and maintaining neutrality, Glenn said the training was theoretical and that facing my first real custody case would reveal I couldn't handle it professionally. Ethan and Noah admitted they'd encouraged Glenn's decision. Ethan said, knowing I was mediating a custody case just like yours and Dad's had made him anxious I'd come home upset. Noah said he'd been having nightmares about our custody battle since learning about my mediation work. The family whose mediation I was supposed to facilitate went to trial. Their attorneys told mutual professional contacts that trial was expensive, hostile, and resulted in a judge's order that satisfied neither parent, exactly what mediation was supposed to prevent. The Mediation Center investigated Glenn's allegations thoroughly. I provided documentation, my training evaluations showing strong neutrality maintenance, testimonials from practice mediation clients, psychological fitness assessments. They reinstated my certification within a week, confirming Glenn's complaints were baseless. But that family's case was already in court. 2 parents and a 6-year-old girl went through the traumatic litigation process I'd trained to help them avoid. I told Glenn I wanted a divorce. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. My second marriage ending because my husband sabotaged my work helping people through divorce. Glenn said I was proving his point, that mediation work had become more important than family. Ethan and Noah were devastated by another divorce, caught between understanding Glenn was wrong and fearing another custody battle. My mediation training director was furious when she learned what happened. She wrote a formal complaint about Glenn's interference and emphasized that my personal divorce experience made me more empathetic, not less neutral. The attorneys who'd referred the custody case to me expressed disappointment. They'd specifically chosen me because my bio mentioned personal experience with high-conflict divorce. They'd wanted a mediator who understood what their clients were experiencing. It's been 6 weeks since Glenn got my first custody mediation canceled. We're separated and proceeding toward divorce. This time, I'll insist we use mediation rather than litigation. The irony of divorcing because he sabotaged my mediation work isn't lost on me. I've since successfully mediated 4 cases, 2 custody disputes, a property division, and a parenting time modification. All 4 reached agreements without trial. 8 parents and 6 children avoided courtroom trauma because mediation worked. Ethan and Noah are in therapy processing their anxiety about my work and their fear of another custody battle. I've promised them this divorce will be different. Glenn and I will mediate, not litigate, and they won't be used as weapons. Glenn sent me research about vicarious trauma in mediators, claiming it proves the work will harm me. He doesn't understand that helping families avoid courtroom battles heals my trauma from my own custody litigation. The Mediation Center director says Glenn's interference was unprecedented, and that my personal experience with high-conflict divorce is an asset, not a liability. Several clients have specifically mentioned appreciating that I understand what they're going through. The family whose mediation was canceled spent $40,000 on trial preparation and legal fees. The judge's custody order gave them alternating weeks, exactly the arrangement I'd been prepared to help them reach through mediation at a fraction of the cost and emotional damage. Some people think I should forgive Glenn since he claims he was protecting families from my supposed bias. But protection doesn't justify filing false allegations that prevented a family from accessing mediation services they'd requested. I'm 40, a certified family mediator, divorcing the husband who sabotaged my first custody mediation and helping families avoid the courtroom trauma I experienced. Every successful mediation proves Glenn wrong. Every agreement reached without trial demonstrates that my divorce experience makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. That 6-year-old girl and her parents deserved the chance to avoid trial through mediation. Glenn made sure they didn't get it, but he couldn't stop me from helping the families who came after them. That's my revenge, continuing mediation work despite his interference, helping parents reach agreements despite his sabotage, and honoring the painful lesson from my own divorce by ensuring other families have alternatives to litigation. 4 families have avoided court through my mediation since Glenn got my first case canceled. Each one is proof he failed to end my mediation career. And when Glenn and I divorce this time, we'll do it through mediation, showing our sons that collaborative process works better than courtroom battles, and proving to myself that I've learned from my mistakes. That's the only revenge that matters. My family got me fired from hospice care before I could help my first patient die peacefully. I'm 44 years old, and 6 weeks ago I became a certified hospice nurse after completing an intensive 18-month nursing program and specialized end-of-life care training. I started this path 3 years ago, 2 years after watching my husband, Michael, die from pancreatic cancer in a hospital where the staff was too overwhelmed to provide the compassionate, dignified death care he deserved. Michael's final days were terrible. Pain poorly managed. Medical interventions continued past the point of benefit. No one with time to sit with him during his most frightened moments. He died in a sterile hospital room with machines beeping, strangers rushing around, none of the peace or dignity we'd hoped for. I was there, holding his hand, but the system failed him. After Michael died, I became obsessed with ensuring others didn't experience the same indignity. Hospice care focuses on comfort, pain management, and emotional support during life's final chapter.
I completed nursing school specifically to provide the compassionate death care Michael never received. My children, Rachel, 19, and Tyler, 16, have been hostile about my hospice work. Rachel thinks helping dying people will keep me stuck grieving Michael. Tyler says knowing I spend days with terminal patients is depressing. Last week I was assigned my first solo patient, Mr. Harrison, 67, late-stage lung cancer, weeks to live. His family wanted in-home hospice care, and I'd spent days preparing to manage his comfort and support his wife through the process. Yesterday, my supervisor called. The hospice agency received complaints alleging I was emotionally unstable and would project unresolved grief onto dying patients. I was terminated immediately. Rachel admitted she'd filed the complaints, saying she was protecting vulnerable people from my death obsession. She'd sabotaged my first chance to help someone die with dignity. When Rachel admitted filing complaints with the hospice agency, she defended it as preventing me from torturing myself by spending every day around dying people. She claimed watching me prepare for Mr. Harrison's care had convinced her I was re-traumatizing myself about Michael's death. I asked how she could sabotage work I'd trained 18 months for. Rachel said those months proved her point. I'd become obsessed with death instead of moving on with life. When I pointed out hospice nurses undergo psychological screening to ensure fitness for end-of-life care, Rachel said those screenings missed how much I was still broken from losing Michael. Tyler admitted he'd supported Rachel's decision. He said knowing I was going to spend weeks helping Mr. Harrison die made him think constantly about Michael's death, and he'd wanted the hospice work to stop. The hospice agency's policy was strict. Any questions about nurse fitness meant immediate termination to protect vulnerable patients. Mr. Harrison was reassigned to a different nurse who'd never met him, didn't know his story, hadn't built the rapport I'd established during intake visits. I called Mr. Harrison's wife to apologize. She was kind but clearly disappointed. She'd chosen me specifically after learning I'd been with my husband through terminal cancer. She'd wanted a nurse who understood what families experience during hospice care. Mr. Harrison died 4 days later. The replacement nurse was professionally competent, but his wife told mutual contacts she'd felt alone during those final days in ways she wouldn't have if I'd been their nurse. I told Rachel and Tyler they'd destroyed meaningful work and cost a dying man the compassionate care I'd trained to provide. Rachel said Mr. Harrison got perfectly good care from the other nurse, and I was being dramatic. My nursing instructor was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a letter condemning Rachel's interference and confirming my fitness for hospice work. But the agency's decision stood. Terminated employees can reapply after 6 months, but aren't guaranteed rehiring. I've found work at a different hospice organization that thoroughly vetted Rachel's allegations before hiring me. I'm now caring for 3 patients in their final weeks, providing the dignity and comfort I couldn't give Mr. Harrison. Rachel and I barely speak. She lives at college and maintains she saved me from work that would have destroyed me. Tyler is in therapy processing his feelings about my career choice. It's been 2 months since Rachel got me fired from my first hospice position. I'm working with a different agency and have helped 5 patients die peacefully so far. Each time I manage someone's pain, sit with them during frightened moments, support their families through grief, I'm providing what Michael didn't get. Rachel sent me articles about burnout in hospice workers, claiming they prove the work will eventually harm me. She doesn't understand that helping others die with dignity heals my trauma about Michael's undignified death. Tyler has started volunteering at a nursing home and is beginning to see end-of-life care as meaningful rather than depressing. He apologized for supporting Rachel's interference. The hospice medical director at my new agency says my experience with Michael's death makes me exceptionally empathetic with families navigating terminal illness. Several patients' families have specifically mentioned appreciating that I understand what they're going through. Mr. Harrison's widow reached out through mutual contacts. She said she wished I'd been their hospice nurse, that the replacement was professionally adequate, but lacked the personal understanding she'd wanted during her husband's final days. That's what Rachel stole. Not just my first patient, but his family's chance to have a nurse who'd walked their path. Some people think I should forgive Rachel, since she claims she was protecting my mental health. But protection doesn't justify filing false fitness allegations that got me fired and deprived a dying man of the specific type of care his family had requested. I'm 44, a hospice nurse helping terminal patients die with dignity, estranged from the daughter who sabotaged my first hospice position, and proving daily that Michael's death prepared me for this work rather than disqualified me from it. Every peaceful death I facilitate proves Rachel wrong. Every family I support through losing a loved one demonstrates that my grief makes me better at hospice care, not worse. Mr. Harrison deserved the compassionate end-of-life support I'd prepared to provide. Rachel made sure he didn't get it, but she couldn't stop me from helping the patients who came after him. That's my revenge. Continuing hospice work despite her interference, providing dignified death care despite her sabotage, and honoring Michael by ensuring others receive the compassionate final days he was denied. 5 patients have died peacefully under my care since Rachel got me fired. Each one is proof she failed to end my hospice nursing career. And that's enough. My family drugged my water bottle so I'd fail the marathon I'd trained 2 years for. I'm 46 years old, and yesterday I was supposed to run my first marathon, 26.2 miles. I'd been training for over 2 years. This race meant everything to me. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer at 43. The treatment was brutal: surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, and left me feeling like my body had betrayed me. When I finished treatment 2 years ago, I decided I needed a goal that would prove to myself I was strong again, that cancer hadn't permanently broken me. A marathon seemed impossible for someone who'd never run more than a 5K and had just finished cancer treatment. But that's exactly why I chose it. I hired a running coach, followed a strict training plan, ran through rain and snow and summer heat. I built up from barely completing 3 miles to running 20-mile training runs. I changed my diet, strength trained, studied nutrition and pacing strategies. Running gave me back my sense of control and strength. My husband, Derek, 48, and teenage children, Madison, 17, and Tyler, 15, have been lukewarm about my marathon training. Derek thinks I'm overdoing it and risking my health. Madison has complained I'm never available because of long weekend runs. Tyler has said training is taking over my life, and I should just be happy being healthy without pushing for athletic achievements. I've tried explaining that the marathon isn't about athletics. It's about reclaiming my body after cancer tried to destroy it. But they don't understand. Yesterday's race went horribly wrong. At mile 8, I felt strange, dizzy, nauseous, weak. By mile 10, I was stumbling. I had to drop out at mile 12, something I'd never done in training. I was devastated. At home, Derek admitted he'd put sleeping medication in my race day water bottle to make sure I didn't hurt myself. My own husband sabotaged my marathon because he decided I shouldn't be running it. When I confronted Derek about drugging my water bottle, he didn't deny it or apologize. He said he'd been genuinely worried about me running 26.2 miles 2 years post-cancer and had decided making sure I didn't finish was better than risking my health. He'd crushed 2 sleeping pills into my water bottle that morning while I was getting dressed, knowing I'd drink it during the race. I asked how he could sabotage something I'd worked 2 years toward. Derek said a marathon was just a race and not worth risking my health. When I pointed out I'd gotten medical clearance from my oncologist, Derek said he didn't trust that my doctor understood the full risks. Madison admitted she'd known about Derek's plan. She said she'd been worried about me running a marathon and had agreed with her dad that preventing me from finishing was protecting me from myself. Tyler claimed he didn't know about the drugging specifically, but admitted he'd hoped I'd give up on marathon stuff because my training schedule had meant missing some of his soccer games. My family had conspired to sabotage my marathon, the goal that had pulled me through cancer recovery, given me strength and purpose, and represented reclaiming my body from disease. I told Derek I wanted him out of the house. He said I was overreacting to him looking out for my well-being. I told Madison and Tyler I was furious they'd supported sabotaging something that mattered deeply to me. Derek moved to his brother's place. Madison said I'm choosing running over family. Tyler said he's glad I didn't finish because now maybe I'll go back to normal. My running coach was horrified when I explained what happened. She said what Derek did was assault, drugging someone without consent, regardless of claimed good intentions. She encouraged me to report it to police. I filed a police report. Derek is now facing potential charges for administering drugs without consent. The race organizers, when I explained what happened, offered me a free entry to next year's marathon. My coach said we'd train again, and I'd finish what my family tried to prevent. It's been 2 weeks since Derek drugged my marathon water bottle. He's still at his brother's, facing criminal charges, and claiming he did nothing wrong by protecting me from a race he decided was too dangerous. Madison has been cold and distant, saying I'm destroying the family by pressing charges against her father. Tyler has started talking to me again, saying he didn't realize drugging was illegal and didn't think it was that serious. My oncologist was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a formal letter stating I was medically cleared for marathon running, that the race posed no unusual health risks given my recovery status, and that preventing me from completing it was based on unfounded medical concerns. Derek's attorney contacted me asking to drop the charges in exchange for Derek agreeing to marriage counseling. I refused. What Derek did wasn't a marriage problem, it was assault. He deliberately put drugs in my water without consent because he decided I shouldn't run a marathon. My running community has been incredibly supportive. Fellow runners who'd completed yesterday's race reached out expressing outrage that my own husband sabotaged my attempt. Several offered to pace me during training for next year's race. I'm training again. The same marathon, 1 year from now. I'll finish what Derek tried to prevent. Madison asked if I'd really rather run a marathon than save your marriage. I told her I'd rather have a family that supports my goals than one that drugs me to stop me from achieving them. Derek maintains he was protecting my health. Medical professionals disagree. The law disagrees. And I disagree. Some people think I should drop the charges since Derek claims he meant well, but good intentions don't justify drugging someone's water bottle to sabotage their athletic achievement. I'm 46, training for next year's marathon, and divorcing the husband who drugged me to prevent me from running this year's race. Derek is dealing with criminal charges and the loss of his marriage. Madison is dealing with her parents' separation and learning that sabotaging someone's goals for their own good has consequences. Tyler has apologized for supporting the plan and is coming on training runs with me now. Next year, I'll cross that finish line, and Derek won't be there to see it. My family got me fired from the prison before I could teach my first literacy class. I'm 38 years old, and 2 months ago, I became a certified educator with the state prison system, teaching adult literacy to incarcerated individuals. I started this path 2 years ago, 6 months after my son Marcus was sentenced to 12 years in state prison for armed robbery at age 20. Watching Marcus enter the system barely able to read at a 5th grade level showed me how illiteracy feeds the cycle of incarceration and recidivism. Marcus had struggled with reading his entire life. We'd tried tutors, special education programs, summer school. Nothing worked. He dropped out at 16, fell in with the wrong crowd, and his limited literacy made legitimate employment nearly impossible. The armed robbery that sent him to prison happened because he couldn't read job applications well enough to get hired anywhere that paid living wages. During Marcus's first year incarcerated, I visited weekly and watched him struggle with prison paperwork, legal documents, and educational materials. He wanted to better himself, but couldn't access GED programs without basic reading skills. The prison offered adult literacy classes, but they were understaffed and oversubscribed. I decided to become part of the solution. I completed a teaching certification in adult education, specialized in literacy instruction for low-skilled adults, studied criminology and recidivism prevention. Last month, I was hired to teach literacy at the state prison, not Marcus's facility, but a different institution where I'd help other families' sons and daughters gain skills that could change their futures. My wife, Vanessa, 39, and our daughter, Keisha, 16, have been hostile about my prison teaching from the start. Vanessa thinks working with inmates will keep me stuck in anger about Marcus's incarceration. Keisha says knowing I'm teaching criminals like Marcus is embarrassing.
Last week, I was scheduled to start my first literacy class. 12 incarcerated men ages 19 to 45, all reading below 6th grade level, all wanting to earn GEDs and improve employment prospects post-release. Then, the prison education director called. The facility received complaints alleging I had inappropriate sympathies for inmates and would undermine security by being too lenient due to having an incarcerated son. My teaching contract was terminated immediately. Vanessa admitted she'd filed the complaints, saying she was protecting me from working in a dangerous environment with people like Marcus. When Vanessa admitted filing complaints with the prison administration, she defended it as preventing me from putting myself at risk working with inmates. She claimed having Marcus incarcerated meant I'd be too sympathetic to manipulate and potentially too trusting in a dangerous environment. I asked how she could assess my security awareness when I'd completed extensive training specifically about maintaining professional boundaries with incarcerated students. Vanessa said that training couldn't overcome my bias towards seeing inmates as victims because of Marcus. When I pointed out the prison education department had thoroughly vetted me knowing about Marcus's incarceration, Vanessa said they'd made a mistake and she'd been correcting it by reporting her concerns. Keisha admitted she'd encouraged Vanessa's decision. She said knowing I was teaching in a prison made her ashamed, and she'd been dreading explaining to friends why her mom worked with criminals. The 12 men enrolled in my literacy class were reassigned to a different instructor who was already teaching 3 other classes. Instead of the small group attention I'd prepared to provide, they joined an overcrowded class where individual instruction was impossible. The prison education director was furious when he learned Vanessa's allegations were baseless. My background check had cleared, my training was solid, and having an incarcerated family member was disclosed during hiring and considered an asset for understanding student challenges. But the termination stood. Prison security policies meant once questions were raised about an educator's fitness, reinstatement required months of additional review. I told Vanessa I wanted a separation. She said I was overreacting and proving that prison teaching had become more important than family. Keisha said she was relieved I wouldn't be working at the prison. My adult education supervisor was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a statement condemning Vanessa's interference and emphasizing that my experience with Marcus's incarceration made me more effective with incarcerated students, not less. One of the 12 students who'd been enrolled in my class sent a message through the education director. He'd been excited to finally learn to read well enough to write letters to his young daughter. Now, he was in an overcrowded class where he'd wait months for individual attention. That's what Vanessa stole. Not just my first teaching opportunity, but that man's chance to connect with his daughter through letters he could write himself. It's been 5 weeks since Vanessa got me fired from prison teaching. We're separated, and I'm staying with my sister. She maintains she saved me from a dangerous work environment.
I've found work teaching adult literacy at a community center, not in a prison, but helping formerly incarcerated individuals and others with low literacy. It's meaningful, but it's not the same as reaching people while they're incarcerated and most motivated to change. Keisha has started talking to me again after her school counselor explained how illiteracy contributes to incarceration. She's beginning to understand that teaching inmates honors Marcus's struggle rather than embarrassing our family. Vanessa sent me news articles about violence against prison employees, claiming they proved the work was too dangerous. She doesn't understand that the literacy classroom was the safest part of the prison. Students who wanted education, not confrontation. The prison education director says, once my security review is complete, I can reapply. But that process takes 6 months minimum, and there's no guarantee the position will still be available. Marcus calls weekly from his facility. When I told him what happened, he said, "Mom, there are guys here who can't even read their own court documents. They need teachers who get it. Don't let Vanessa stop you." Some people think I should forgive Vanessa, since she claims she was worried about my safety. But concern doesn't justify filing false security allegations that got me fired from teaching incarcerated men who desperately needed literacy education. I'm 38, a certified adult education teacher, separated from the wife who sabotaged my prison teaching career, and helping formerly incarcerated individuals while waiting to reapply for prison work. Every student I teach at the community center proves Vanessa wrong. Every person whose literacy improves demonstrates that Marcus's incarceration makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. Those 12 men in my canceled class deserved small group literacy instruction. Vanessa made sure they didn't get it. But she couldn't permanently stop me from teaching the populations she finds embarrassing. That's my revenge. Continuing adult literacy education despite her interference, helping people trapped by illiteracy despite her sabotage, and honoring Marcus's struggle by ensuring others get the educational opportunities he never had. Marcus has 8 more years to serve. When he's released, he'll have a GED and marketable skills because prison education programs exist. I became a prison educator to strengthen those programs for families like ours. Vanessa tried to stop that work. She failed to end it permanently, only delayed it. And when I'm back teaching in a prison classroom in 6 months, helping incarcerated men learn to read well enough to write to their children, apply for jobs, and break cycles of recidivism, Vanessa won't be part of that achievement. She made sure of that when she filed false security complaints that got me fired before my first literacy class. My family got me removed from Crisis Hotline, where I'd answered 2,000+ calls over 4 years. I'm 44 years old, and for the past 4 years I've been a volunteer counselor at the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. I answer crisis calls from people in desperate situations, suicidal individuals, people in mental health crises, those experiencing trauma or loss. It's emotionally demanding work, but it's the most meaningful thing I've ever done. I started volunteering 4 years ago, 6 months after my son Ethan died by suicide at age 16. Ethan had been struggling with depression, and despite therapy and medication, he took his life in our garage while I was at work. Finding him, living with the guilt of not recognizing how bad things had gotten, nearly destroyed me. A grief counselor suggested I might find purpose in crisis work, turning my unbearable loss into helping others in similar pain. I applied to the crisis hotline, went through 40 hours of intensive training in suicide intervention, active listening, and crisis de-escalation. I started taking calls and discovered I was good at it. Over 4 years, I've answered over 2,000 crisis calls. I've talked people down from suicide attempts, helped callers develop safety plans, connected people with mental health resources. The work is heartbreaking but powerful. Each call is a chance to save someone the way I couldn't save Ethan. My husband, Brian, 46, and daughter, Chloe, 18, have always been uncomfortable with my crisis work. Brian thinks reliving trauma through callers' stories is unhealthy, and preventing me from moving on from Ethan's death. Chloe says hearing me talk to suicidal people through our home office door is triggering, and I should find different volunteer work. Last month, I was selected to train new crisis counselors, an honor given to experienced volunteers with strong performance records. The training was scheduled for last weekend. 3 days before, my supervisor called saying the hotline had received serious allegations about my counseling practices. Anonymous reports claimed I'd been projecting personal trauma onto callers and providing inappropriate advice based on my son's suicide rather than proper crisis protocols. The allegations were investigated. I was removed from the volunteer roster entirely. 4 years of crisis work, over 2,000 calls answered, ended because someone claimed I couldn't separate my personal loss from professional counseling. Brian admitted he'd filed the complaints. He said my crisis work was keeping me stuck in grief, and he'd been trying to help me move on from Ethan's death by forcing me away from suicide prevention. When Brian admitted he'd filed false complaints with the crisis hotline, he showed no remorse. He said he'd been watching me suffer through 4 years of answering suicide calls and had decided my volunteer work was preventing healing rather than helping it. I asked how he could destroy work that gave my life meaning after Ethan's death. Brian said meaning built on constantly reliving our son's suicide through strangers' crisis calls wasn't healthy meaning. It was trauma bonding that kept me from processing grief properly. When I pointed out I'd been vetted, trained, and supervised by mental health professionals who'd never raised concerns about my counseling, Brian said those supervisors didn't know the full extent of how much the work was affecting me at home. Chloe admitted she'd supported Brian's decision to file complaints. She said listening to me counsel suicidal callers from home had been traumatic for her, bringing back memories of Ethan's death constantly. She'd hoped getting me removed from crisis work would make our home peaceful again. I told them both they'd destroyed something sacred, my ability to turn unbearable loss into saving others' lives. Brian said I could find healthier ways to honor Ethan that didn't involve immersing myself in suicide prevention. The crisis hotline director was sympathetic when I explained the complaints had been filed by family members who disapproved of my volunteer work. But she said once allegations about counselor fitness had been formally investigated, they couldn't simply reinstate me. Doing so would undermine the complaint process designed to protect vulnerable callers. I could reapply to volunteer in 6 months, go through training again and start over. But my 4 years of experience, my 2,000+ calls answered, my selection to train new counselors, all of that was gone because Brian decided crisis work was bad for my mental health. I told Brian I wanted a divorce. He said I was proving his point, that crisis work had become more important to me than family. I said, family that sabotages meaningful grief work isn't family worth keeping. Chloe said I was choosing strangers on a phone line over your own daughter. I told her I was choosing to honor her brother's memory by preventing other families from experiencing our loss, and that she and Brian had stolen that from me. Brian has moved out. Chloe is staying with him, barely speaking to me. My crisis hotline colleagues rallied. Several wrote letters supporting my reinstatement, citing calls where I'd successfully intervened with suicidal callers and demonstrating my counseling effectiveness. But policy is policy. I'm waiting 6 months to reapply. Meanwhile, the work that gave me purpose after Ethan's suicide is gone, because my husband decided I was too damaged to help other people in crisis. It's been 6 weeks since Brian got me removed from crisis counseling. The divorce is proceeding. He's shocked I'm ending our marriage over volunteer work, not understanding that what he destroyed wasn't just volunteer work, but my grief recovery and my way of honoring Ethan. Chloe has started therapy and is slowly coming to understand why crisis work mattered to me. She admitted she'd been angry that I seemed more invested in helping strangers than in helping our family heal.
We're working on rebuilding, but it's fragile. The crisis hotline offered me a different volunteer role during my 6-month waiting period. I can't counsel callers, but I can help with administrative work and resource coordination. It's something, but it's not the same as being on the front lines saving lives. Brian maintains he did the right thing. He sent me an article about complicated grief and secondary trauma, claiming it proves crisis work was damaging my mental health. He doesn't understand, or refuses to understand, that the work was healing, not harmful. My therapist, who I've seen since Ethan's death, wrote a letter supporting my crisis work and stating it had been a healthy part of my grief process. But that letter came too late to prevent my removal. In 4 months, I can reapply. I'll go through training again, restart as a new volunteer, rebuild what Brian destroyed. Some people say I should forgive him since he claims he was worried about me. But worry doesn't justify sabotaging someone's grief recovery work through false allegations to their volunteer organization. I'm 44, divorced from the husband who got me removed from suicide prevention work, and waiting 6 months to reclaim the volunteer role that gave my life meaning after my son's death. Every day that passes is another day I'm not answering crisis calls, not helping people in desperate situations, not doing the work that turned my unbearable loss into something purposeful. Brian took that from me, and I'll never forgive him for it. The crisis hotline saved my life after Ethan's suicide by giving me purpose. And I saved over 2,000 callers' lives by being there when they needed someone most. My husband decided that work was too painful for me to continue. He was wrong. 4 months from now, I'll be back on the phones, answering crisis calls, saving lives in Ethan's memory. And Brian won't be part of that journey. He made sure of that when he filed false complaints that ended 4 years of meaningful work. That's what I'm living for now, getting back to the work he tried to take from me permanently. Every call I answer after reinstatement will be proof he failed to stop me. My family got me fired from memory care before my first music therapy session. I'm 40 years old, and 3 weeks ago I became a board-certified music therapist, specializing in dementia and Alzheimer's care. I use structured musical interventions, familiar songs, rhythm exercises, instrument play, to help memory care patients access emotions, memories, and communication abilities their disease has stolen. I started this path 2 years ago, 6 months after watching my mother, Patricia, die from Alzheimer's at age 68. Mom's Alzheimer's progression was devastating. Over 7 years, she went from forgetting appointments to not recognizing my face. Words disappeared, then comprehension, then personality. The vibrant woman who'd taught piano for 40 years became someone who couldn't speak, walk, or feed herself. She died not knowing who I was. During Mom's final year in memory care, I noticed something remarkable. Music therapists would visit, and Mom, who couldn't communicate verbally anymore, would hum along to songs from her youth. For those brief moments, I'd see recognition in her eyes, connection to something she'd lost. Music reached parts of her brain Alzheimer's hadn't destroyed yet. I decided to become a music therapist who could give other families those precious moments. I completed a music therapy degree, studied neurology and dementia care, practiced with clinical internships, passed board certification exams. Last month, I was hired by Serenity Gardens Memory Care to provide individual and group music therapy for their 40 residents. My husband, Craig, 42, and our kids, Owen, 15, and Nora, 12, have been hostile about my memory care work. Craig thinks working with Alzheimer's patients will keep me stuck grieving Mom's death. Owen says knowing I'm around people like Grandma is depressing. Nora worries I'll get too sad working with dementia patients. Last week, I was assigned my first solo client, Mr. Chen, 73, mid-stage Alzheimer's, former violinist, increasingly agitated and nonverbal. His family requested music therapy, hoping to calm his anxiety and help him communicate.
Our first session was scheduled for yesterday, introducing him to therapeutic music activities that could improve his quality of life. Then, the clinical director called. Serenity Gardens received complaints alleging I was emotionally unstable due to my mother's Alzheimer's death and would project unresolved grief onto vulnerable patients. My employment was terminated effective immediately. Craig admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting dementia patients from my trauma. He'd sabotaged my first chance to help someone like Mom. When Craig admitted filing complaints with Serenity Gardens, he defended it as preventing me from using dementia patients to process grief about Mom's death. He claimed watching me prepare music materials for Mr. Chen had convinced him I'd fall apart when confronted with Alzheimer's symptoms like Mom's. I asked how he could assess my therapeutic fitness when I'd completed 2 years of clinical training, specifically preparing me to work with dementia patients despite personal loss. Craig said that training couldn't override the trauma of watching Mom deteriorate for 7 years. When I pointed out the memory care facility's clinical director had thoroughly vetted me, knowing about Mom's Alzheimer's, Craig said she'd overlooked how emotionally compromised I was because she needed staff. Owen and Nora admitted they'd begged Craig to get me fired. Owen said knowing I was working with Alzheimer's patients, just like Grandma, made him remember her final years constantly. Nora said she'd been having nightmares about me forgetting who I am, like Grandma did. Mr. Chen's music therapy was postponed while Serenity Gardens found a replacement therapist. His family had specifically requested someone who could help him connect through violin music, his lifelong passion that Alzheimer's was stealing from him. The clinical director investigated Craig's allegations within 48 hours. I provided extensive documentation, my clinical internship evaluations showing appropriate emotional boundaries, my board certification proving competence, letters from supervisors confirming my fitness despite personal history. They cleared me completely, but said their termination policy meant I'd need to reapply rather than being automatically reinstated. Mr. Chen was assigned to a different music therapist who specialized in dementia care but had no string instrument background. I told Craig I wanted a separation. He said I was overreacting and proving that music therapy work had become more important than family. Owen said he was relieved I wouldn't be working at the memory care anymore. Nora was conflicted, starting to understand the work mattered, but still frightened by associations with her grandmother's decline. My music therapy clinical supervisor was furious when I explained what happened. She wrote a formal statement condemning Craig's interference and emphasizing that my experience with Mom's Alzheimer's made me uniquely qualified to work with dementia patients, not disqualified. Mr. Chen had his first session with the replacement therapist. According to the clinical director, he was agitated and resistant, not engaging with the guitar-based activities the new therapist offered. He'd been a violinist his entire life. Guitar meant nothing to him. That's what Craig stole, Mr. Chen's chance to reconnect with music through the instrument that had defined his identity before Alzheimer's took it away. It's been 3 weeks since Craig got me fired from Serenity Gardens. We're separated, and he's living with his parents. He maintains he saved vulnerable patients from my unprocessed grief. I've been hired by a different memory care facility that thoroughly investigated Craig's allegations before employing me. I'm now working with 5 dementia patients, using music therapy to help them access memories, reduce anxiety, and communicate when words fail them. Owen has started therapy processing his unresolved grief about his grandmother and his anxiety about dementia. His therapist says his fear that I'll forget him like Grandma forgot you is driving his opposition to my work. Nora has been asking questions about music therapy and wants to attend one of my sessions to see what I actually do. She's beginning to understand that helping patients like her grandmother honors Patricia's memory. Craig sent me research about caregiver burnout in dementia care professionals, claiming it proves the work will eventually destroy me. He doesn't understand that helping Alzheimer's patients connect through music heals my grief about Mom's lost abilities.
The memory care facility's medical director says my personal experience with Alzheimer's progression makes me more effective with families navigating their own loved one's decline. Several patients' relatives have mentioned appreciating that I understand what they're going through. Mr. Chen continued with the replacement therapist for 2 more sessions before his family withdrew him from music therapy. The clinical director told me confidentially that without violin-based interventions, Mr. Chen showed no interest in the program. His family had hoped music therapy would help him. Craig's interference meant it didn't. Some people think I should forgive Craig since he claims he was protecting dementia patients from my emotional instability. But protection doesn't justify filing false allegations that got me fired and cost Mr. Chen therapeutic services his family had specifically requested. I'm 40, a board-certified music therapist working with Alzheimer's patients, separated from the husband who sabotaged my first client, and proving daily that Mom's disease prepared me for this work rather than disqualified me from it. Every patient I help proves Craig wrong. Every moment I use music to reach someone trapped by dementia demonstrates that my experience makes me better at this work, not worse. Mr. Chen deserved music therapy centered on violin, the instrument that had been his life before Alzheimer's. Craig made sure he didn't get it. But Craig couldn't stop me from helping the patients whose sessions came after. That's my revenge. Continuing music therapy despite his interference, helping dementia patients despite his sabotage, and honoring Mom's memory by giving other families the moments of connection that music provided us in her final year. 5 patients have found comfort and communication through music therapy sessions I've facilitated since Craig got me fired from Serenity Gardens. Each one is proof he failed to end my work with Alzheimer's patients. Mom spent her final year unable to speak, but she could still hum along to familiar songs. I became a music therapist to give other families those precious moments of recognition and connection. Craig tried to stop that work. He failed. And every patient who lights up hearing a song from their youth is evidence that my experience with Mom's Alzheimer's makes me exactly the right person for this specialized therapy. My family got me removed from search and rescue before my first mission for a missing child. I'm 41 years old, and 2 months ago, I became a certified wilderness search and rescue volunteer after 14 months of intensive training. I started this journey 3 years ago, 6 months after my daughter, Mia, went missing during a family camping trip. She was 7 years old when she wandered from our campsite and disappeared into dense forest. The search took 26 agonizing hours before she was found hypothermic and dehydrated, but alive, 2 miles from camp. Those 26 hours of not knowing if Mia was dead or alive, of watching search teams comb the forest, of feeling utterly helpless while strangers risked their lives to find my child, it changed me. When Mia came home safely, I was overwhelmed with gratitude to the volunteers who'd saved her. I wanted to become one of them. Search and rescue training is rigorous: wilderness first aid, navigation, tracking, rope rescue, cold water survival. I attended weekend trainings, practiced grid searches, learned radio protocols. I got certified in wilderness medicine, studied lost person behavior, trained in difficult terrain. Last month I was certified and added to our county's SAR team roster. My husband, Brett, 43, and Mia, now 10, have been opposed to my SAR work from the start. Brett thinks responding to searches will re-traumatize me about Mia's disappearance. Mia says knowing I'm out looking for lost people makes her anxious I won't come home. Yesterday our SAR team was activated. An 8-year-old boy missing in the same forest where Mia disappeared. This was my first real mission. I'd trained 14 months for this moment, to help a family the way others had helped mine. Then our team coordinator called. Anonymous complaints alleged I was emotionally unstable and would compromise mission safety due to my unresolved trauma about Mia. I was removed from the mission pending psychological evaluation. The boy was found this morning, alive but injured after 31 hours missing.
Brett admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting me from reliving Mia's disappearance. He'd sabotaged my first real chance to help find a lost child. When Brett admitted filing complaints that got me removed from the search mission, he defended it as preventing my psychological breakdown. He'd decided that searching for a lost child in the same forest where Mia disappeared would trigger PTSD, and I'd be useless or dangerous to the mission. I asked how he could assess my psychological fitness when SAR team psychologists had already evaluated and cleared me. Brett said those evaluations didn't account for the specific trigger of searching the exact location where Mia went missing. When I pointed out my personal experience with that terrain made me more valuable, I knew the area intimately, understood where frightened children might hide. Brett said my emotional connection would cloud my judgment and put searchers at risk. Mia admitted she'd begged Brett to keep me off the mission. She said knowing I was out searching for another lost child made her relive her own disappearance, and she'd been terrified I'd get lost too. The 8-year-old boy, Justin, was found after 31 hours. He'd fallen into a ravine and couldn't climb out. The search took longer than necessary because teams initially focused on wrong areas. I'd suggested searching the ravine system based on lost person behavior patterns I'd studied, but I wasn't on the mission to advocate for that search priority. The SAR coordinator who'd removed me from the mission called after Justin was found. She'd completed her investigation and confirmed Brett's allegations were baseless. My training records showed excellent performance. My psychological evaluations were solid, and my team supervisors had no concerns about my fitness. She apologized for removing me based on anonymous complaints that turned out to be family interference. But the apology didn't change that I'd missed my first real mission, that Justin's family had suffered extra hours of terror, and that my expertise could have shortened the search. I told Brett I wanted a divorce. He said I was overreacting and proving SAR work had become more important than family. Mia was distraught, caught between her fear of me doing SAR work and understanding that what Brett did was wrong. The SAR team has been supportive. Several experienced searchers told me Brett's interference was unprecedented, and that my removal had genuinely impacted the mission. My knowledge of that terrain and my insights about likely hiding spots for scared children would have been valuable. Justin's parents sent me a thank you card, even though I hadn't participated in the search. Someone had told them about my training and that I'd been removed due to false complaints. They wrote, "We're sorry you couldn't be part of bringing our son home. We hope you'll be there for the next family." It's been 3 weeks since Brett got me removed from Justin's search. We're separated, and he's moved to his sister's place. He maintains he saved me from a psychological crisis by preventing me from searching for a lost child in triggering terrain. The SAR team activated twice since then. I participated in both missions, one successful rescue of injured hikers, one recovery of a deceased elderly man with dementia who'd wandered from his care facility. Both missions went well, and my team coordinator praised my performance. Mia has started therapy to address her anxiety about my SAR work. Her therapist says Mia's fear that I'll disappear if I go on searches is understandable, but shouldn't control my choices. We're working on helping her understand that my training keeps me safe, and that helping lost people honors how strangers saved her. Brett sent me articles about vicarious trauma in rescue workers, claiming they prove SAR work will eventually harm me. He doesn't understand that responding to searches helps me heal from the helplessness I felt during Mia's disappearance. The SAR coordinator has assigned me as a mentor for new trainees. She says my experience as both a victim's parent and a certified rescuer gives me unique perspective for teaching lost person behavior and family liaison protocols. Justin's case haunts me. The ravine where he was found was in the search area I'd suggested prioritizing. If I'd been on the mission, I might have advocated more strongly for checking that location earlier. Those extra hours he spent injured and alone, I'll never know if my presence could have shortened them.
Some people think I should forgive Brett since he claims he was protecting my mental health. But protection doesn't justify filing false fitness complaints that removed me from a mission where my expertise could have helped. I'm 41, a certified wilderness SAR volunteer, separated from the husband who sabotaged my first real mission and responding to searches despite his interference. Every successful mission proves Brett wrong. Every lost person found demonstrates that my training matters and my experience helps rather than hinders. Justin was found alive after 31 hours. I should have been part of that search. Brett made sure I wasn't. But I'm on the team for every search going forward, and Brett's false complaints won't stop me from helping families the way volunteers helped us when Mia was lost. That's my revenge. Continuing SAR work despite his sabotage, proving my trauma makes me more effective at finding lost people and being there for the next terrified family waiting for their child to come home. The training I completed wasn't wasted. Brett only delayed my first mission. He didn't end my SAR career. Every search I participate in is proof he failed to stop me from turning the worst 26 hours of my life into the skills that bring people home safely. My family got me removed from equine therapy before my first veteran PTSD session. I'm 41 years old, and 5 weeks ago I became a certified equine therapy specialist, working with military veterans suffering from PTSD. I help veterans process trauma through structured interactions with horses, grooming, leading, and caring for animals in ways that promote emotional regulation and trust building. I started this journey 2 years ago, 18 months after my husband, Daniel, died by suicide following years of struggling with combat-related PTSD from Iraq. Daniel was a Marine Corps veteran who returned from 2 deployments emotionally shattered. He tried traditional therapy, medication, support groups. Nothing worked. His PTSD destroyed his ability to work, maintain relationships, or find peace. He died by suicide in our garage 3 years after his final deployment, leaving me and our 2 daughters devastated and full of questions about what more we could have done. During my grief process, my therapist suggested equine therapy, working with horses to process trauma and regulate emotions. I was skeptical but desperate, so I tried it. Something about the horse's calm presence, the non-judgmental interaction, the physical work of caring for them. It helped me access grief I couldn't reach through talk therapy alone. I learned that equine therapy is especially effective for veterans with PTSD. Horses respond to human emotions without the complexity of human relationships that many traumatized veterans find overwhelming. I decided to become an equine therapist specifically for veterans like Daniel, helping them find healing he never received. My current partner, Rob, 43, and my daughters Emma, 16, and Lily, 14, have been opposed to my equine therapy work from the start. Rob thinks working with PTSD veterans will keep me stuck, grieving Daniel's suicide. Emma says knowing I work with people like Dad makes her relive his death. Lily worries I'll get too attached to veteran clients and be devastated if they struggle like Daniel did. Last week I was assigned my first client, Sergeant Hayes, 34, Iraq veteran struggling with severe PTSD, multiple suicide attempts, resistant to traditional therapy. Our first equine therapy session was scheduled for yesterday, introducing him to the horses and beginning the trust-building process that could help him heal. Then the program director called. The Equine Therapy Center received allegations that I was emotionally compromised due to Daniel's suicide and would project unresolved trauma onto vulnerable veteran clients. My certification was suspended. Sergeant Hayes' session was canceled. Rob admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting vulnerable veterans from my suicide grief. When Rob admitted filing complaints with the Equine Therapy Center, he justified it as preventing me from imposing Daniel's suicide on veteran clients who were already struggling. He claimed watching me prepare for Sergeant Hayes' session had convinced him I'd break down when confronted with a veteran's PTSD.
I asked how he could assess my therapeutic readiness when I'd completed 2 years of specialized training specifically preparing me to work with traumatized veterans despite my personal history. Rob said that training couldn't prepare me for the emotional reality of facing a suicidal veteran like Daniel. When I pointed out the center's clinical director had thoroughly vetted me, knowing about Daniel's suicide, and considered my experience an asset for understanding veteran struggles, Rob said the director had made a mistake that he was correcting. Emma and Lily admitted they'd begged Rob to get me removed from veteran work, Emma said. Knowing I was meeting with a PTSD veteran who'd attempted suicide made her terrified I'd fall apart like after Dad died. Lily said she couldn't handle worrying about me being around people who might kill themselves. The Equine Therapy Center investigated Rob's allegations within 72 hours. I provided extensive documentation, my clinical training records, psychological fitness evaluations, testimonials from my equine therapy instructors, letters from my grief therapist confirming my readiness to work with traumatized veterans. They cleared me completely and reinstated my certification. But Sergeant Hayes' session had already been rescheduled with a different therapist. The rapport-building process I'd prepared for was lost. Sergeant Hayes' case manager told me later that he'd been resistant to trying equine therapy and had only agreed because my bio mentioned my husband's PTSD suicide. He'd wanted a therapist who truly understood what families of PTSD veterans experience. Rob's interference meant he got a different therapist, and while professionally competent, that therapist had never lost a spouse to combat-related suicide. I told Rob I wanted him to leave. He said I was overreacting and proving that equine therapy work had become more important than our relationship. Emma and Lily were caught between understanding Rob was wrong and feeling guilty that their anxiety about Daniel triggered this situation. My equine therapy training director was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a formal statement condemning Rob's interference and emphasizing that my experience with Daniel's PTSD and suicide made me uniquely qualified to work with struggling veterans, not disqualified from it. Sergeant Hayes completed his first equine therapy session with the replacement therapist. According to mutual professional contacts, the session went adequately, but Hayes remained guarded and skeptical about the process, exactly the resistance I'd been prepared to work through using my understanding of Daniel's similar reluctance to try alternative therapies. It's been 4 weeks since Rob got me removed from Sergeant Hayes' session. We've separated, and he's staying with his brother. He maintains he saved vulnerable veterans from my unresolved trauma. I've since worked with 3 veteran clients, all combat veterans with PTSD, all struggling with suicidal ideation, all resistant to traditional therapy. The equine therapy sessions have gone well, and my clinical supervisor says my experience with Daniel helps me build trust with veterans who feel misunderstood by therapists without military-connected backgrounds. Emma and Lily have started family therapy, processing their anxiety about my work and their unresolved grief about Daniel's suicide. Their therapist says their fear that I'll be broken by working with PTSD veterans stems from feeling broken themselves by Daniel's death. Rob sent me articles about vicarious trauma in therapists working with suicidal clients, claiming they prove the work will eventually destroy me. He doesn't understand that helping veterans find healing Daniel never accessed is therapeutic, not traumatic. The Equine Therapy Center's clinical director says Rob's interference created unnecessary delays in Sergeant Hayes' care, and that my personal experience with combat PTSD suicide is precisely why I'm effective with resistant veteran clients. Sergeant Hayes has continued equine therapy with the other therapist and is making some progress. But I'll always wonder if having a therapist who'd lost a spouse to combat-related suicide would have helped him open up faster, trust the process sooner, and feel less alone in his struggle. Some people think I should forgive Rob since he claims he was protecting veterans from my supposed emotional instability. But protection doesn't justify filing false allegations that delayed treatment for a suicidal veteran. I'm 41, a certified equine therapy specialist working with PTSD veterans, separated from the partner who sabotaged my first veteran client, and proving daily that Daniel's suicide prepared me for this work rather than disqualified me from it. Every veteran I help through equine therapy proves Rob wrong. Every client who finds healing through working with horses demonstrates that my loss makes me better at this work, not worse. Sergeant Hayes deserved the therapist he'd specifically wanted, someone who understood PTSD from the family side. Rob made sure he didn't get that. But Rob couldn't stop me from helping the veterans whose sessions came after. That's my revenge, continuing equine therapy despite Rob's interference, helping traumatized veterans despite his sabotage, and honoring Daniel's memory by ensuring other veterans get the alternative healing options he never fully embraced. 3 veterans have found relief through equine therapy sessions I facilitated since Rob got me removed from Sergeant Hayes' case. Each one is proof he failed to end my work with PTSD veterans. Daniel died believing he was beyond help. I became an equine therapist to prove that belief wrong for other struggling veterans. Rob tried to stop that work. He failed. And every veteran who learns to regulate emotions through caring for horses is evidence that my experience with Daniel's suicide makes me exactly the right person for this specialized therapy. My family got me removed from the Child Advocacy Center before my first forensic interview. I'm 39 years old, and 4 weeks ago, I became a certified child forensic interviewer at our county's Child Advocacy Center. I conduct specialized interviews with children who've reported abuse, interviews designed to gather evidence while minimizing trauma. I started this path 2 years ago, 18 months after my daughter Chloe disclosed that her soccer coach had been sexually abusing her for months. The disclosure and investigation process was horrific. Chloe had to repeat her story to police, detectives, prosecutors, and therapists. Each retelling re-traumatized her until she finally broke down and refused to cooperate further. The case fell apart without her testimony, and her abuser was never charged. Watching the system fail Chloe because the interview process was too traumatic showed me how crucial proper forensic interviewing is. I decided to become a forensic interviewer who could do better. I completed 40 hours of specialized training in child development, trauma-informed questioning, and forensic interview protocols. I practiced with mock interviews, studied anatomy and abuse disclosure patterns, learned to ask legally sound questions without leading or re-traumatizing children. My partner, Drew, 41, and Chloe, now 13, have been opposed to my work from the start. Drew thinks interviewing abused children will keep me traumatized about Chloe's abuse. Chloe says knowing I spend days talking to kids like me makes her relive what happened. Last week, I was assigned my first solo interview. Emma, age 7, who'd disclosed sexual abuse by a family member. The interview was scheduled for yesterday. One chance to gather evidence while protecting Emma from having to repeat her story multiple times. Then, my supervisor called. The center received allegations that I was emotionally compromised and would project trauma onto child victims. My interview privileges were suspended. Emma's interview was delayed by a week while they found another interviewer. Drew admitted he'd filed the complaints, claiming he was protecting vulnerable children from my unresolved trauma. When Drew admitted filing complaints with the Child Advocacy Center, he justified it as preventing me from re-traumatizing abused children with my baggage from Chloe's case. He claimed watching me prepare for Emma's interview had convinced me I'd break down or project anger onto the 7-year-old. I asked how he could assess my interview readiness when I'd completed extensive training specifically preparing me to remain neutral and child-focused despite personal experience. Drew said that training couldn't prepare me for the emotional reality of facing my first abused child. When I pointed out the center's psychologist had evaluated and cleared me for casework, Drew said that evaluation didn't account for how much I still struggled with guilt over not protecting Chloe. Chloe admitted she'd begged Drew to get me removed from the interview. She said knowing I was going to talk to a 7-year-old about sexual abuse made her imagine her own disclosure interviews, and she'd been terrified I'd be as overwhelmed as she'd felt. The investigation cleared me within 48 hours. My training supervisors confirmed my fitness, my practice interviews showed appropriate boundaries, and my psychological evaluation was solid. But Emma's interview had already been rescheduled with a different interviewer. That week's delay mattered. Emma was living with relatives while the investigation proceeded, separated from siblings and struggling with the disclosure process. Every extra day she waited to complete her forensic interview was another day she spent in limbo, wondering if she'd be believed. The interviewer who took my place was professionally competent, but I'd been specifically assigned Emma's case because my supervisor thought my experience with Chloe would help me understand Emma's fear and resistance. Drew's interference meant Emma got a different interviewer who'd never experienced what families of abuse victims go through. I told Drew I wanted him to leave. He said I was overreacting and proving that forensic interviewing had become more important than family. Chloe was caught between understanding Drew was wrong and feeling guilty that her trauma history was connected to my work. My training director was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a formal statement condemning Drew's interference and emphasizing that my personal experience made me more empathetic, not less effective. Emma's delayed interview went well, according to my supervisor, and the case is proceeding. But that extra week she spent waiting, wondering if anyone would believe her, second-guessing her disclosure. That's what Drew's false complaints cost her. It's been 3 weeks since Drew got me removed from Emma's interview. We're separated, and he's staying with friends. He maintains he saved vulnerable children from my emotional instability. I've since conducted 4 forensic interviews, 2 sexual abuse cases, 1 physical abuse, 1 child witnessing domestic violence. All 4 went well, and my supervisor says I'm maintaining excellent professional boundaries while using my experience appropriately to build rapport with frightened children. Chloe has started trauma therapy specifically addressing her feelings about my work. Her therapist says Chloe's anxiety that I'll be broken by interviewing abused children stems from her own feelings of brokenness after what happened to her. Drew sent me research about secondary trauma in child abuse professionals, claiming it proves the work will destroy me. He doesn't understand that helping other children through the disclosure process heals my guilt about how Chloe's case was mishandled. My supervisor says Drew's interference created dangerous precedent, allowing family members to remove forensic interviewers based on unfounded mental health claims could delay justice for abused children. Emma's case resulted in charges being filed against her abuser. The prosecutor said my replacement interviewer did solid work, but I'll always wonder if having an interviewer who'd personally experienced a child's disclosure falling through the system would have made Emma feel more understood. Some people think I should forgive Drew since he claims he was protecting children from my supposed trauma responses. But protection doesn't justify filing false allegations that delayed a 7-year-old abuse victim's forensic interview. I'm 39, a certified child forensic interviewer, separated from the partner who sabotaged my first case, and conducting interviews that help prosecute child abusers. Every successful interview proves Drew wrong. Every child I help through the disclosure process demonstrates that Chloe's failed case makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. Emma deserved her interview to happen on schedule. Drew's interference cost her a week of uncertainty, but he couldn't stop me from helping the children whose interviews came after hers. That's my revenge, continuing forensic interviewing despite his sabotage, helping abused children despite his interference, and honoring Chloe's difficult experience by ensuring other children have trained interviewers who understand their fear. 4 children have completed forensic interviews with me since Drew got me removed from Emma's case. Each one is proof he failed to end my work at the Child Advocacy Center. Chloe's abuser was never charged
because the interview process re-traumatized her into silence. I became a forensic interviewer to prevent that from happening to other children. Drew tried to stop me. He failed. And every child whose interview I conduct with compassion and skill is evidence that my experience as Chloe's mother makes me exactly the right person for this work. My family got my wildlife rehab permit revoked before my first eagle release ceremony. I'm 37 years old, and 4 months ago I became a licensed wildlife rehabilitator specializing in raptor recovery, hawks, eagles, and owls injured by car strikes, window collisions, or power line accidents. I started this work 3 years ago, 2 years after my son, Oliver, died at age 6 when a distracted driver hit him crossing the street to our house. Oliver's death shattered me. Grief made normal life impossible. My therapist suggested spending time in nature, so I started hiking in state parks. On one hike, I found an injured red-tailed hawk, called Wildlife Rescue, and watched rehabilitators care for it. Something clicked. The focused, purposeful work of healing injured creatures gave me a way to channel devastating loss into saving lives. I volunteered with a wildlife rescue center, learned raptor handling and medical care, studied avian biology and rehabilitation protocols. I built proper housing facilities in my large backyard, got permits from state and federal wildlife agencies, completed required training certifications. Last month, I received my official license to rehabilitate raptors independently. My first patient was Aurora, a young bald eagle found with a broken wing after hitting power lines. I've spent 4 months nursing her back to health, working with avian veterinarians, building her strength through flight conditioning. She's ready for release. The ceremony was scheduled for today, a public event where Aurora would be released back to the wild, with wildlife officials, media coverage, and school children attending to learn about conservation. My wife, Vanessa, 39, and our daughter, Lily, 11, have been unsupportive of my rehabilitation work. Vanessa thinks caring for injured raptors is obsessive grieving for Oliver. Lily says the large flight cages in our backyard are creepy. Yesterday, state wildlife officials called. Anonymous complaints alleged I was improperly caring for protected species and operating without proper permits. My license was suspended pending investigation. Aurora's release ceremony was canceled. Vanessa admitted she'd filed the complaints, saying she was protecting wildlife from my grief-driven hobby. When Vanessa admitted filing false complaints with state wildlife officials, she defended it as necessary intervention. She claimed I'd become obsessed with Aurora's recovery and was replacing Oliver with injured birds rather than processing his death healthily. I asked how she could sabotage 4 months of Aurora's rehabilitation and the release ceremony meant to celebrate her recovery. Vanessa said releasing one eagle wasn't worth my mental health deterioration from constantly working with dying animals. When I pointed out Aurora wasn't dying, she'd fully recovered and was ready to return to the wild, Vanessa said she'd watched me grieve every raptor that didn't survive rehabilitation and had decided the work was re-traumatizing me about losing Oliver. Lily admitted she'd encouraged Vanessa's decision. She said having raptor cages in the backyard was weird, and she'd been embarrassed when friends came over. She'd hoped getting my permits revoked would mean the cages would be removed. I explained that Aurora's release ceremony was scheduled with wildlife officials, media, and school children who'd learn about conservation. The cancellation disappointed everyone and left Aurora waiting in a flight cage when she should be soaring free. State wildlife officials investigated quickly. I provided complete documentation, proper permits, veterinary records showing appropriate care, facility inspections confirming housing met all regulations. They cleared me within 48 hours, confirming Vanessa's allegations were baseless. But the public release ceremony couldn't be rescheduled. The media coverage was arranged for today specifically. The school children had other commitments. The wildlife officials had conflicting schedules. Aurora could still be released, but privately, without the educational component that was supposed to inspire conservation awareness.
I told Vanessa I wanted a separation. She said I was overreacting and proving raptor rehabilitation had become more important than family. Lily said she was glad the public ceremony was canceled because she'd been dreading it. The avian veterinarian who'd worked with Aurora was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a statement confirming Aurora received exemplary care and that Vanessa's complaints had no medical basis. I released Aurora yesterday in a quiet field with just the wildlife officer required to document the release. She circled overhead 3 times before flying toward the mountains. It should have been a triumphant moment shared with hundreds of people. Instead, it was bittersweet, celebrating Aurora's freedom while mourning the educational event Vanessa had destroyed. It's been 2 weeks since Vanessa got Aurora's release ceremony canceled. We're separated, and I'm staying with my brother. Vanessa maintains she did what was necessary to stop my unhealthy obsession with wildlife rehabilitation. The school children who were supposed to attend Aurora's release sent me drawings of eagles they'd made in preparation for the event. Their teacher said the students were disappointed to miss seeing a real eagle return to the wild. That's what Vanessa stole. Not just Aurora's public release, but children's opportunity to witness conservation in action. Lily has started asking questions about why raptor rehabilitation matters to me. I explained that saving injured wildlife helps me cope with not being able to save Oliver, that healing eagles and hawks gives me purpose after devastating loss. My wildlife rehabilitation mentor says Vanessa's interference was sabotage of conservation work, and that public releases serve critical educational purposes. She's helped me plan a different public event for my next rehabilitated raptor. I currently have 2 patients, a red-tailed hawk recovering from window collision and a screech owl with wing damage. Both should be releasable within months. Their releases will be public events, and Vanessa won't be invited. Some people think I should understand Vanessa's concern about my mental health. But concern doesn't justify filing false wildlife violations that got my permits temporarily suspended and canceled, an educational event benefiting conservation awareness. I'm 37, a licensed wildlife rehabilitator, separated from the wife who sabotaged my first eagle release, and continuing to heal injured raptors despite her interference. Aurora is flying free in the mountains. Vanessa couldn't prevent that. She only prevented the public celebration and educational component that would have inspired others to care about wildlife conservation. Every raptor I rehabilitate and release proves Vanessa failed to stop my work. Every bird that returns to the sky is evidence that turning grief into healing wild creatures isn't obsession. It's purposeful recovery. The next public release will happen. Media will cover it. Children will learn from it. And Vanessa's attempt to sabotage my rehabilitation work will be a footnote in a successful conservation career. That's my revenge. Continuing to save wildlife despite her interference, proving that healing injured raptors helps me heal from Oliver's death, and showing Lily that purposeful work can emerge from unbearable loss. Aurora is free. More raptors will follow. And Vanessa's false complaints couldn't stop any of it, permanently. My family got me removed from the forensics lab before I could testify in my first murder trial. I'm 43 years old, and 5 months ago I became a certified forensic DNA analyst working for the State Crime Laboratory. I started this career path 3 years ago, 18 months after my son Liam was murdered at age 15 in an unsolved shooting. His case went cold due to lack of physical evidence and witness cooperation. Watching investigators struggle with limited forensic resources showed me how crucial proper evidence analysis is to solving violent crimes. After Liam's death consumed me with helplessness, I decided to become part of the system that could solve cases like his. I went back to school for a biology degree, specialized in forensic genetics, completed laboratory certification training, passed competency exams. Last year I was hired by our state forensics lab analyzing DNA evidence from violent crime scenes.
The work is meticulous and emotionally heavy. Every sample represents someone's worst day, someone's lost loved one, someone's search for justice. But it's meaningful. Each match I identify could solve a case, bring closure to a family, remove a dangerous person from the streets. My wife, Angela, 42, and our daughter, Brianna, 18, have been uncomfortable with my forensics work since I started training. Angela thinks working with murder evidence will keep me traumatized about Liam's death. Brianna says knowing I spend days analyzing blood and tissue from crime scenes is disturbing. Last month, I completed analysis on a critical murder case, DNA from a sexual assault homicide that could identify the perpetrator. The trial started this week, and I was scheduled to testify yesterday as the expert witness explaining how DNA evidence linked the defendant to the victim. Then my lab supervisor called. The prosecutor's office had received credible concerns about my mental fitness to testify, alleging my unresolved trauma about Liam's murder would compromise my professional testimony. I was pulled from the witness list. Angela admitted she'd contacted the prosecutor claiming I was emotionally unstable. She'd sabotaged my first major court testimony because she decided forensic work was unhealthy grief processing. When Angela admitted contacting the prosecutor about my mental fitness, she justified it as preventing me from having a breakdown on the witness stand. She'd decided that testifying about murder evidence would trigger PTSD about Liam's death, and I'd fall apart during cross-examination. I asked how she could assess my courtroom readiness when I'd completed extensive expert witness training, specifically preparing me for testimony. Angela said that training couldn't prepare me for the emotional reality of discussing murder evidence in front of a jury. When I pointed out the lab's staff psychologist had evaluated and cleared me for casework involving violent crimes, Angela said that psychologist didn't know the full extent of my trauma about Liam. Brianna admitted she'd supported Angela's decision. She said, knowing I was going to court to talk about someone getting killed like Liam had made her anxious, and she'd begged Angela to stop me from testifying. The prosecutor was furious when he learned Angela's allegations were baseless. My testimony was critical to the case, and replacing me with a different analyst at the last minute weakened the prosecution. The defense could argue the substitution indicated problems with the original analysis. My lab supervisor conducted an emergency fitness review, confirming I was fully capable of providing expert testimony. But the trial schedule couldn't accommodate the delay. Another analyst testified using my written reports, but without my detailed first-hand explanation of the testing process and results. The jury acquitted the defendant. The prosecutor said afterward that my detailed testimony explaining DNA probability statistics might have made the difference. The victim's family had waited 3 years for trial, and the person accused of murdering their daughter walked free. I told Angela I wanted a divorce. She said I was overreacting and proving that forensics work had become more important than family. Brianna said she was relieved the trial was over and I didn't have to testify. My lab director was supportive, confirming my fitness for future testimony and flagging Angela's interference as inappropriate contact with prosecutors. But the damage to that case was permanent. The defendant was acquitted and can't be retried due to double jeopardy. The victim's mother sent me a heartbreaking message. Someone had told her about my situation, and she wrote, "I know you did your best analyzing the evidence. I'm sorry your family prevented you from helping bring justice for my daughter." It's been 4 weeks since Angela got me removed from testimony in the murder trial. We're separated, and divorce proceedings have started. She maintains she saved me from psychological trauma by preventing my courtroom appearance. I've since testified in 2 other cases, both successfully, with no emotional breakdowns or professional issues. My testimony helped secure convictions in an armed robbery and a rape case. The prosecutor who'd lost the murder trial specifically requested me for both cases, saying my detailed analysis and clear explanations make strong impressions on juries. Brianna has started therapy and is working through her anxiety about my forensics career. She's beginning to understand that analyzing evidence honors Liam's memory rather than dishonoring it. Angela sent me articles about secondary trauma in forensic professionals, claiming they prove the work will eventually harm me. She doesn't understand that solving other families' cases helps me cope with Liam's remaining unsolved. The murder case I was removed from will haunt me. The DNA evidence I analyzed clearly matched the defendant, but without my expert testimony explaining the statistical probability, the jury had reasonable doubt. A woman's killer walked free partly because Angela decided I was too damaged to testify. My lab supervisor says Angela's interference set dangerous precedent. Allowing family members to remove expert witnesses based on unfounded mental health claims undermines the justice system. Some people think I should forgive Angela since she claims she was protecting me from trauma. But protection doesn't justify contacting prosecutors with false allegations that removed critical expert testimony from a murder trial. I'm 43, a certified forensic DNA analyst, separated from the wife who sabotaged my first major court testimony, and continuing to analyze evidence despite her interference. Every conviction I help secure proves Angela wrong. Every case where my testimony helps a jury understand DNA evidence demonstrates that Liam's unsolved murder makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. The woman whose case went to trial deserved justice. Her family deserved closure. Angela's interference may have prevented both. That's what I live with. Knowing my expertise could have made the difference between conviction and acquittal. But I wasn't allowed to testify because my wife decided murder evidence would traumatize me. Liam's killer was never found. I became a forensic analyst to help find other killers. Angela tried to stop me from doing exactly that. She failed to end my career, but she succeeded in undermining one family's search for justice, and I'll never forgive her for that. Every case I testify in now is proof she couldn't permanently silence my expertise, and that's the only revenge that matters. Continuing the work despite her sabotage, helping solve violent crimes despite her interference, and honoring Liam by making sure other families get the justice we never got. My family got me fired from the hospital before my first sexual assault examination. I'm 42 years old, and 4 weeks ago I became a certified sexual assault nurse examiner, SANE, at our regional hospital's emergency department. SANE nurses provide specialized care to sexual assault victims, collecting forensic evidence, treating injuries, offering compassionate support during the most traumatic hours of someone's life. I started this path 2 years ago, 18 months after my daughter Isabel was sexually assaulted at a college party, and the emergency room nurse who examined her was rushed, clinical, and made an already horrific experience even more traumatic. Isabel was 19 when she was raped. The police referred her to the ER for a forensic exam, the evidence collection process that's crucial for prosecution, but invasive and re-traumatizing. The nurse who performed Isabel's exam was technically competent, but emotionally detached. She treated my daughter like a crime scene rather than a traumatized person, completing the exam in 30 minutes without explaining procedures or offering comfort. Isabel left feeling violated all over again. Watching the system fail Isabel during her most vulnerable moment showed me how crucial compassionate, sane care is. I decided to become the nurse Isabel deserved but didn't get. I completed 40 hours of specialized SANE training in forensic evidence collection, trauma-informed care, and victim advocacy. I practiced with simulation patients, studied anatomy and assault injury patterns, learned to balance thoroughness with compassion. My husband, Tim, 44, and Isabel, now 21, have been opposed to my SANE work from the start. Tim thinks examining assault victims will re-traumatize me about Isabel's rape. Isabel says knowing I'm doing what that nurse did to me makes her relive her exam. Last week I was assigned my first patient. Maya, 23, reported sexual assault earlier that day. Needed forensic exam and evidence collection. The exam was scheduled for yesterday. one chance to collect time-sensitive evidence while treating Maya with the dignity and compassion Isabel had been denied. Then my nurse manager called. The hospital received complaints alleging I was emotionally compromised due to Isabel's assault and would project trauma onto victims. My SANE privileges were suspended pending investigation. Maya's exam was performed by a different nurse who'd never experienced sexual assault from either victim or family perspective. Tim admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting vulnerable assault victims from my unresolved trauma. When Tim admitted filing complaints with the hospital, he defended it as preventing me from imposing Isabel's assault on vulnerable patients. He claimed watching me prepare my forensic evidence kit for Maya had convinced him I'd break down during the invasive examination process. I asked how he could assess my clinical readiness when I'd completed specialized SANE training, specifically preparing me to remain professional despite personal experience. Tim said that training couldn't prepare me for the emotional reality of examining my first rape victim. When I pointed out the hospital's clinical supervisor had thoroughly vetted me, knowing about Isabel's assault, Tim said the supervisor had overlooked my emotional vulnerability because SANE certified nurses are in short supply. Isabel admitted she'd begged Tim to get me removed from SANE work. She said knowing I was going to perform the same invasive exam she'd endured made her relive her own assault, and she'd been terrified I'd be as detached as the nurse who'd examined her, or alternatively, too emotional to complete the procedure properly. The hospital investigated within 48 hours. I provided extensive documentation, my SANE training evaluations showing appropriate emotional boundaries, my clinical supervisor's assessment confirming my fitness, testimonials from simulation training instructors praising my balance of thoroughness and compassion. They reinstated my SANE privileges completely. But Maya's exam had already been completed by the nurse who took my place, the same nurse who'd performed hundreds of SANE exams with professional competence, but without the personal understanding of what assault victims experience during evidence collection. I told Tim I wanted a divorce. He said I was overreacting and proving that SANE work had become more important than our marriage. Isabel was caught between understanding Tim was wrong and feeling guilty that her assault history was connected to my work. My SANE training coordinator was appalled when I explained what happened. She wrote a formal statement condemning Tim's interference and emphasizing that my experience with Isabel's assault made me uniquely qualified to provide trauma-informed care, not disqualified from it. Maya's forensic exam was completed and evidence was collected. But I'll always wonder if having a SANE nurse who'd personally experienced a loved one's assault would have made the process less re-traumatizing for her. If my understanding of what victims need during that vulnerable exam would have made a difference in her healing. It's been 4 weeks since Tim got me removed from Maya's exam. We're divorced. He filed immediately when I refused to quit SANE work, and I didn't contest it. He maintains he saved vulnerable assault victims from my emotional instability. I've since performed 6 SANE exams, 5 adult sexual assault victims, and 1 pediatric case. Every exam has been thorough for forensic purposes while prioritizing the patient's emotional needs. My supervisor says my approach of explaining every step, offering choices about pacing, and treating patients as traumatized people rather than crime scenes has been exemplary. Isabel has started trauma therapy, specifically addressing her feelings about my SANE work. Her therapist says Isabel's anxiety that I'll be cold like that nurse, or too emotional to help, stems from her own unprocessed trauma about her assault and exam. Tim sent me research about secondary trauma in SANE nurses, claiming it proves the work will destroy me. He doesn't understand that helping assault victims through compassionate evidence collection heals my helplessness about how poorly Isabel's exam was conducted. The hospital's SANE program director says Tim's interference delayed critical forensic evidence collection, and that my personal experience with a family member's assault is precisely why I'm effective with frightened, traumatized patients. One of my recent patients sent a card through the hospital thanking me for making the worst day of my life slightly more bearable. She wrote, "You explained everything. You let me take breaks. You treated me like a person. Thank you for being different than what I expected." Some people think I should forgive Tim since he claims he was protecting assault victims from my supposed emotional compromise. But protection doesn't justify filing false allegations that prevented Maya from having the trauma-informed, sane nurse she deserved. I'm 42, a certified sane nurse, divorced from the husband who sabotaged my first forensic exam, and providing compassionate care to sexual assault victims despite his interference. Every patient I examine with thoroughness and compassion proves Tim wrong. Every assault victim who leaves the exam feeling treated with dignity demonstrates that Isabel's experience makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. Maya deserved a sane nurse who understood assault from the family perspective. Tim made sure she didn't get that, but he couldn't stop me from helping the victims whose exams came after hers. That's my revenge. Continuing sane work despite his sabotage, treating assault victims with the compassion Isabel was denied, and honoring her difficult experience by ensuring other victims receive trauma-informed forensic care. 6 assault victims have received compassionate, sane exams from me since Tim got me removed from Maya's case. Each one is proof he failed to end my work with sexual assault survivors. Isabel's exam was completed by a technically competent but emotionally detached nurse. I became a sane to ensure other victims get both competence and compassion. Tim tried to stop that work. He failed. And every patient who feels treated with dignity during their forensic exam is evidence that my experience as Isabel's mother makes me exactly the right person for this specialized nursing. My family got my TEDx talk canceled 3 days before I was scheduled to speak. I'm 39 years old, and 3 days ago, I was supposed to give a TEDx talk about surviving domestic violence and rebuilding life after abuse. I'd been preparing for 18 months, writing, rehearsing, working with TEDx coaches to craft a powerful 12-minute presentation about escaping my abusive first marriage and finding strength through advocacy work with other survivors. My first husband, Craig, was violent throughout our 8-year marriage. The abuse escalated until I finally escaped with my 2 daughters when I was 34. Leaving took everything. I lost our home, most possessions, financial security. But I gained safety and started rebuilding. I got therapy, joined support groups, eventually became a peer counselor helping other domestic violence survivors navigate their own escapes. 2 years ago, I met and married Jason, 42, a widower with teenage stepchildren, Brittany, 16, and Evan, 14. Jason knows my history but prefers I don't discuss it publicly. He thinks talking about my abusive past is dwelling on negativity rather than focusing on our new life together. Last year, I was selected to give a TEDx talk at our city's annual event. The selection committee loved my story, how I escaped violence, rebuilt confidence, now help other survivors. I'd spent 18 months crafting every word, practicing delivery, preparing to share my experience with hundreds of people and potentially millions online. My daughters, Kelsey, 17, and Morgan, 15, were proud. But Jason, Brittany, and Evan were uncomfortable. Jason thought going public would define me by my worst experience. Brittany worried her friends would see the talk and judge our family. Evan said having a stepmom who talks about being hit was embarrassing. 3 days before the event, TEDx organizers called. Anonymous reports claimed I'd exaggerated or fabricated abuse details and was seeking attention rather than genuinely helping survivors. My talk was canceled pending investigation. Jason admitted he'd filed the reports. He said he was protecting our family's reputation from my need to broadcast trauma publicly. He'd sabotaged my TEDx talk because he was embarrassed by my domestic violence survival story. When Jason admitted filing false reports with TEDx, he defended it as necessary to prevent me from humiliating the family by discussing my abusive first marriage publicly. He said my daughters Kelsey and Morgan would be traumatized having their mother's abuse story accessible online forever, and that Brittany and Evan shouldn't have to explain to classmates why their stepmother was that TED Talk lady who got beat up. I asked how he could sabotage 18 months of preparation for a talk meant to help other abuse survivors. Jason said there are private ways to help survivors that don't involve performing my trauma on stage for strangers. When I pointed out TEDx talks often feature difficult personal experiences and that sharing survival stories helps others recognize they're not alone, Jason said my situation was different because my story reflects on our current family, and he hadn't consented to having my past advertised publicly. Brittany and Evan admitted they'd encouraged Jason's decision. Brittany said she'd been mortified thinking about classmates watching my talk and knowing her stepmom had been in an abusive relationship. Evan said having a stepmom who goes around talking about being a victim was uncomfortable. My daughters, Kelsey and Morgan, were furious when they learned Jason had gotten my talk canceled. Kelsey said she'd been planning to bring friends to watch me speak. Morgan said she was proud I was using my experience to help others, and that Jason had no right to silence my story. The TEDx organizers investigated Jason's allegations. I provided documentation, police reports from domestic violence incidents during my first marriage, restraining orders against Craig, records from the women's shelter where I'd stayed, testimonials from my therapist and peer counseling supervisor confirming my story's accuracy. TEDx cleared me within 48 hours, confirming Jason's reports were false. But the event had already happened. My speaking slot was given to another presenter. Hundreds of people attended, thousands more would watch online, and my talk about surviving domestic violence and helping other survivors wasn't part of it. I'd prepared 18 months to share a story that might help someone recognize their own abuse situation or find courage to leave. Jason had stolen that opportunity because he was embarrassed by my past. I told Jason I wanted a separation. He said I was overreacting and proving that my obsession with the abuse story was unhealthy. Brittany said I was choosing a canceled speech over family. Evan said he was glad I didn't give the talk. TEDx offered me a spot at next year's event, but the momentum was gone. The specific talk I'd prepared, the words I'd agonized over, the delivery I'd practiced hundreds of times, all built for an event that happened without me. It's been 3 weeks since Jason got my TEDx talk canceled. We're separated, and I'm staying with my sister. Jason maintains he did nothing wrong by preventing me from publicly embarrassing our family with my domestic violence history. The TEDx organizers have been supportive, emphasizing that my story matters and next year's event will be powerful. But I keep thinking about the people who attended this year's event, particularly domestic violence survivors who might have heard my talk and felt less alone, or people in abusive relationships who might have recognized their situations and sought help. Jason's interference didn't just cancel my talk, it potentially prevented my story from reaching someone who needed to hear it. Kelsey and Morgan want me to divorce Jason. They say anyone who'd sabotage my advocacy work to protect his own comfort doesn't respect me or my survival journey. They're right. Brittany has apologized, saying she didn't understand how important the talk was until she researched domestic violence statistics and realized how many people need to hear survivor stories. Evan remains uncomfortable with the whole situation. My peer counseling supervisor says several survivors I've worked with wanted to attend my talk to support me. They'd cleared their schedules, arranged childcare, prepared to watch me share the journey we'd discussed in support groups. Jason's false reports stole that shared moment. Some people think I should understand Jason's discomfort with my past being discussed publicly. But my survival story isn't shameful. Escaping Craig,
rebuilding my life, helping other survivors. That's strength, not embarrassment. Jason decided my story reflected badly on him and erased my opportunity to share it with people who needed to hear it. I'm 39, separated from the husband who canceled my TEDx talk, and preparing for next year's event where I'll finally share my domestic violence survival story. Every day I counsel survivors, I think about how my canceled talk might have reached someone in crisis. That's what Jason stole. Not just my speaking opportunity, but the potential impact on people suffering what I survived. Next year's talk will be more refined, more powerful, and Jason won't be there to see it. That's my revenge. Speaking despite his attempt to silence me, sharing my story despite his embarrassment, helping survivors despite his interference. The talk he canceled will happen, just 1 year later than it should have. And when it goes online, reaching potentially millions of people, Jason will know he failed to keep me silent. My voice matters. My story helps people. And no husband's embarrassment will stop me from using my survival to help others escape their own abuse. That's what I'm living for now. And I'm at peace with it. My family got me decertified as a sign language interpreter the day before my first job. I'm 43 years old, and last month, I became a certified American Sign Language interpreter after 3 years of intensive study. I started learning ASL 4 years ago, 6 months after my daughter Lily died in a car accident at age 14. Lily had been deaf since birth, and our family had learned basic signs to communicate with her, but we'd relied heavily on professional interpreters for complex communication. When Lily died, the hospital emergency room staff couldn't communicate directly with her in those critical minutes before I arrived. The interpreter didn't get there in time. Lily was conscious but terrified, unable to understand what was happening or tell doctors about her symptoms. By the time communication was established, she'd lost too much blood. She died, confused and scared, unable to talk to anyone around her. After Lily's death, I became obsessed with the interpreter shortage that leaves deaf people vulnerable in emergencies. I enrolled in ASL courses, studied obsessively, practiced with deaf community members, attended immersion workshops. I progressed from basic signs to fluent conversation to specialized medical and legal terminology. 3 years of daily study culminated in passing the certification exam to become a qualified interpreter. My husband, Kevin, 45, and sons Brandon, 18, and Lucas, 16, have been dismissive of my interpreting studies. Kevin thinks I'm trying to replace Lily by working with deaf people. Brandon says learning ASL is living in the past instead of moving forward from Lily's death. Lucas has said my interpreting practice sessions at home are uncomfortable reminders of his sister. I've explained this work honors Lily's memory by ensuring other deaf people don't face the communication barriers that complicated her final moments. But my family sees it as unhealthy grief. Last week, I got my first professional assignment, interpreting for a deaf patient's medical appointments at the hospital where Lily died. It felt like completing a circle, using skills I'd built from grief to help others. Then, the certification board called saying my credentials were under investigation. Anonymous complaints claimed I'd cheated on certification exams and wasn't actually fluent enough to interpret professionally. The investigation suspended my certification pending review. My first interpreting job was canceled. Kevin admitted he'd filed the complaints saying he was protecting deaf people from my fake qualifications built on grief obsession rather than genuine skill. When Kevin admitted filing false complaints about my ASL certification, he defended it as necessary intervention. He claimed he'd observed my signing and believed I wasn't truly fluent, just memorizing phrases without deep language comprehension. I asked how he, someone who knew only basic signs from communicating with Lily, could assess my professional level fluency. He said he'd consulted with people who know ASL, who'd expressed concerns about my skill level. When I demanded to know who these people were, Kevin admitted he'd shown video of me practicing signs to an online forum, and anonymous users had said my signing looked awkward or textbook rather than natural. He'd taken anonymous internet comments as evidence I'd somehow faked passing rigorous certification exams. Brandon and Lucas admitted they'd supported Kevin's decision. Brandon said he'd been uncomfortable watching me practice ASL constantly and thought getting my certification revoked would force me to move on from Lily. Lucas said the interpreting work was weird and he'd hoped I'd find normal hobbies. I told them interpreters undergo extensive testing, written exams, live interpreting assessments, evaluations by certified professionals. Passing required demonstrating actual fluency,
not just memorization. Kevin said the certification board made mistakes sometimes, and he'd been ensuring quality control by reporting his suspicions. The deaf patient whose appointments I was supposed to interpret for had to reschedule while finding another interpreter. The hospital that had hired me questioned whether I'd actually earned my certification legitimately. I spent 2 weeks gathering evidence, videos of me interpreting complex conversations fluently, testimonials from deaf community members I'd practiced with, statements from my ASL instructors confirming my skill progression, documentation of my certification exam scores. The board reviewed everything and confirmed my certification was legitimately earned. They reinstated my credentials and noted the complaints had been filed by a family member with no professional basis for assessing interpreter qualifications. But the damage was done. The hospital withdrew their initial job offer, concerned about the controversy around my certification. My first professional interpreting opportunity was gone because Kevin had convinced them I might be a fraud. I told Kevin I wanted a divorce. He said I was overreacting and proving that interpreting had become an unhealthy obsession. I told Brandon and Lucas they'd supported destroying work I'd spent 3 years building to honor their sister's memory. Kevin moved out. Brandon is staying with him, saying I'm choosing deaf strangers over family. Lucas is conflicted, starting to understand the work mattered but hurt. I'm divorcing his father. My ASL instructors and deaf community connections rallied, writing recommendations and helping me find new interpreting opportunities. I have assignments lined up with different agencies who verified my credentials and weren't concerned about Kevin's false complaints. It's been 6 weeks since Kevin got my first interpreting job canceled. The divorce is proceeding, and he maintains he had legitimate concerns about my fluency, despite the certification board confirming I'd earned credentials legitimately. Brandon refuses to speak to me, calling me obsessed with dead sister's language. Lucas has started learning some ASL himself, saying he wants to understand what I've been working toward. The deaf community has been incredibly supportive. Several deaf individuals I'd practiced with wrote powerful statements about my interpreting skill and how my fluency had grown over 3 years of dedicated study. One wrote, "She learned our language to honor her daughter and help our community. That's not fake, that's love." Kevin sent me articles about complicated grief and unhealthy coping mechanisms, claiming my interpreting work fits these patterns. He doesn't understand, or refuses to understand, that turning Lily's death into helping others isn't unhealthy coping, it's meaningful purpose. I've completed several professional interpreting assignments now, medical appointments, legal consultations, educational settings. Each one feels like honoring Lily while serving people who face the communication barriers she lived with. The hospital where Lily died has rehired me for their deaf patient services after reviewing my credentials and speaking with satisfied clients. Interpreting there, in the building where my daughter died, unable to communicate with emergency responders, feels like closing a painful circle. Some people think I should forgive Kevin since he claims he was protecting deaf people from potentially unqualified interpreters. But he wasn't protecting anyone. He filed false complaints because he wanted to force me away from work he saw as grief obsession. I'm 43, a certified ASL interpreter, divorced from the husband who tried to destroy my credentials, and building a career helping deaf people communicate in situations where Lily couldn't. Kevin thought reporting me to the certification board would permanently end my interpreting work. He was wrong. Every assignment I complete proves he failed. Every deaf person I help communicate with doctors, lawyers, or educators is evidence that my skills are real and my work matters. The patient whose appointments I was supposed to interpret for originally has requested me specifically for future sessions. She said, knowing I learned ASL after losing my deaf daughter makes her trust me more, not less. That's what Kevin tried to destroy. The opportunity to turn unbearable loss into meaningful service. He failed. My certification stands, my skills are real, and my work honoring Lily continues without him. That's my revenge. Succeeding at the work he tried to sabotage, proving my fluency is legitimate, and helping the deaf community despite his attempt to portray me as a fraud. Every sign I interpret is proof he couldn't stop me. And that's enough. My family got me removed from the doula service right before my first birth as a certified doula. I'm 42 years old, and 3 months ago, I became a certified birth doula after completing 18 months of intensive training. A doula provides continuous physical, emotional, and informational support to mothers before, during, and after childbirth. I started this journey 2 years ago, 18 months after I nearly died giving birth to my youngest child, Sophie. Sophie's birth was traumatic. 36 hours of labor ending in emergency C-section, massive hemorrhaging, 3 blood transfusions, 5 days in ICU. I survived, but the experience left me with PTSD around childbirth and deep empathy for women navigating the terrifying, transformative process of bringing life into the world. After therapy helped me process my birth trauma, I wanted to turn that experience into helping others. Doula work seemed perfect. Supporting mothers through labor, advocating for their choices, providing comfort during one of life's most intense experiences. I completed certification training, attended practice births under supervision, studied pain management techniques, and birth advocacy. Last month, I was certified and added to the doula services roster. My husband, Marcus, 44, and my older children Dylan, 16, and Alexis, 14, have been skeptical of my doula work. Marcus thinks attending births will re-traumatize me. Dylan has said my birth story is too personal to be sharing with clients. Alexis worries I'm not over Sophie's birth and shouldn't be around pregnant women. I've explained that helping others through birth is healing, not harmful, but they remain unconvinced. Last week, I was matched with my first client, Jennifer, a first-time mother due in 3 weeks. We'd had several prenatal meetings where I learned her birth preferences and we built rapport. I was excited and nervous to finally put my training into practice. Then, the doula service director called saying, concerning information had been reported about me. Anonymous complaints claimed I was emotionally unstable from my own birth trauma and would project fears onto clients instead of providing proper support. The investigation led to my removal from the roster. My husband admitted he'd filed the complaints, saying he was protecting vulnerable pregnant women from my unresolved trauma. Marcus had destroyed my first opportunity to serve as a doula because he decided I wasn't healed enough to help others through childbirth. When Marcus admitted filing complaints about my doula certification, he justified it as genuine concern that attending births would trigger my PTSD from Sophie's delivery. I asked how he could sabotage work I'd trained 18 months for based on his amateur psychological assessment. He said watching me prepare for Jennifer's birth had made him nervous I'd have a panic attack during labor or give inappropriate advice based on my traumatic experience rather than the client's actual needs. Dylan and Alexis admitted they'd supported Marcus's decision. Dylan said he'd been uncomfortable hearing me discuss my birth trauma during doula training. Alexis said she worried I'd break down while attending someone else's birth and embarrass our family. I told them birth doulas are extensively trained to separate personal experiences from client support, that my certification required demonstrating exactly that capability, and that supervision during practice births had confirmed my readiness. Marcus said my supervisors didn't know the full extent of my PTSD. When I pointed out my therapist had written a letter supporting my doula work as part of healthy trauma processing, he said therapists have to be supportive. Jennifer, my first client, was reassigned to another doula. She sent me a kind message saying she'd been looking forward to having me at her birth and was disappointed about the change. Reading that message, knowing Marcus had stolen that opportunity from both of us, was devastating. The doula service director said I could reapply in 6 months after addressing the concerns raised about my emotional readiness. But my certification, my months of training, my careful preparation, all meaningless because Marcus decided I was too traumatized to help others. I told Marcus I wanted a separation. He said I was overreacting and proving his point that doula work had become an obsession. I told Dylan and Alexis they'd supported destroying something meaningful to me based on unfounded fears. Marcus moved to his brother's house. Dylan said I'm choosing strangers' births over our family. Alexis started asking questions about why I wanted to be a doula, beginning to understand it was about healing and purpose, not obsession. My doula training cohort was outraged when they learned what happened. Several offered to write testimonials about my competence and emotional stability during training. My birth trauma therapist wrote an updated letter stating my doula work was therapeutically appropriate and beneficial. I'm fighting my removal, submitting documentation proving I'm fully capable of providing doula services without projecting personal trauma. It's been 2 months since Marcus got me removed from doula service. We're separated, and he still maintains he did the right thing, protecting pregnant women from my supposed instability. Jennifer's baby was born 3 weeks ago. I saw the announcement on social media. Another doula attended her birth. That should have been me, supporting a first-time mother through labor, using my training to provide comfort and advocacy. Marcus stole that experience. The doula service reviewed my appeal with all the supporting documentation. They reinstated my certification, acknowledging the complaints had been filed by a family member who disapproved of my work, rather than by anyone with legitimate professional concerns. I'm back on the roster. My next client is due in 6 weeks, a mother expecting twins who specifically requested a doula with personal experience of complicated births. My trauma is becoming my strength in supporting others, exactly as it should be. Dylan has apologized, saying he didn't understand doula work before, but researched it and realizes it's legitimate healthcare support, not obsession. Alexis is proud of me now, telling friends her mom helps mothers through childbirth. Marcus refuses to apologize. He sent me an article about secondary trauma in birth workers, claiming it proves I shouldn't be doing this work. He doesn't understand that my training specifically addressed managing personal history while supporting clients. My therapist calls my doula work post-traumatic growth, transforming terrible experience into helping others. That's exactly what it is. Some people say I should forgive Marcus since he claims he was worried about my mental health. But concern doesn't justify sabotaging professional certification through false complaints to the organization I'd trained 18 months to work with. I'm 42, certified as a birth doula, separated from the husband who tried to end my doula career before it started, and preparing to attend my second client's birth next month. Marcus thought filing complaints would permanently remove me from birth work. He failed. Every birth I attend as a doula is proof he couldn't stop me from turning trauma into purpose. Every mother I support through labor is evidence that my difficult birth experience makes me better at this work, not worse. Jennifer's birth should have been my first. Marcus stole that. But he can't steal the births I'll attend going forward, the mothers I'll support, the healing I'll find in helping others through the experience that nearly killed me. That's my revenge. doing the work he tried to prevent, thriving in the role he claimed I was too damaged to fill. The next birth I attend will be Marcus-free, judgment-free, and exactly what I trained for. And that's all that matters now. My family got me fired from Addiction Recovery Center before my first group session. I'm 45 years old, and last month I became a certified peer recovery specialist, working at a residential addiction treatment center. I started this path 2 years ago, 18 months after my son Jake died of a fentanyl overdose at age 21. Jake had struggled with opioid addiction for 3 years, cycling through multiple treatment attempts, relapses, and increasingly dangerous using patterns. I'd tried everything to save Jake: interventions, treatment programs, tough love, unconditional support. Nothing worked. His final overdose happened alone in a motel bathroom. The coroner said he died instantly from fentanyl-laced pills he'd thought were legitimate painkillers. Jake's death destroyed me. Grief consumed everything until my therapist suggested channeling it into helping other addicts. I started attending support groups for families of addicts, where I met peer recovery specialists, people in recovery themselves who counsel and support others struggling with addiction. I realized I could do similar work as someone who'd experienced addiction's devastation from the family side. I completed 300 hours of training, studied addiction science and trauma-informed care, passed certification exams. Last month, I was hired by Renewal House, a 60-bed residential treatment center, to facilitate family support groups and mentor clients working toward recovery. My wife, Sharon, 44, and our younger son, Caleb, 17, have been hostile about my recovery work. Sharon thinks working with active addicts will keep me stuck in grief over Jake. Caleb says being around people like his brother triggers memories he's trying to forget. Yesterday, I was scheduled to facilitate my first family support group, 8 relatives of current Renewal House residents meeting to discuss supporting loved ones through recovery. I'd prepared extensively, reviewing case files and planning discussion topics. Then the program director called. The center had received complaints that I was using my position to process personal grief rather than serving clients professionally, and that my unresolved trauma about Jake made me unfit to work with addicts. I was terminated immediately. Sharon admitted she'd called Renewal House claiming I was emotionally unstable. She'd sabotaged my first group session because she decided recovery work was unhealthy grief processing. When Sharon admitted filing complaints with Renewal House, she said she'd been watching me become obsessed with Jake's addiction story and had decided working with active addicts would destroy what's left of our family. She claimed I'd been replacing Jake with the residents I'd been assigned to mentor. I asked how she could sabotage work I'd trained 300 hours for. Sharon said those training hours proved her point. I'd become consumed by addiction recovery instead of focusing on healing our remaining family. When I pointed out my certification supervisors had specifically evaluated my fitness to work with addicts despite personal loss, Sharon said those evaluators didn't see how much time I spent reading Jake's old journals and researching the addiction that killed him. Caleb admitted he'd supported Sharon's decision. He said knowing I was working at a treatment center surrounded by people just like Jake made him feel like our family was stuck in addiction forever, even though Jake was gone. The Renewal House program director was sympathetic when I explained the complaints came from family opposition rather than professional concerns. But their policy was firm. Once questions about counselor fitness were raised, termination was immediate to protect vulnerable clients. I could reapply in 6 months with updated psychological evaluations, but my first group session was canceled, and the 8 families who'd been scheduled to meet with me were reassigned to another facilitator. One of those families had a 19-year-old daughter in treatment for heroin addiction, almost Jake's age when his addiction began. The mother had specifically requested me after learning I'd lost a son to overdose. She'd wanted support from someone who understood her terror of losing her child. Sharon's interference meant that mother got a different facilitator who, while professionally trained, hadn't experienced what we had. I told Sharon I wanted a separation. She said I was proving her point, that recovery work mattered more to me than our marriage. Caleb said he was relieved I wasn't working at Renewal House anymore because knowing I was there had been triggering. My peer recovery training cohort was outraged. Several wrote letters supporting my reinstatement, citing my strong performance during training practicum. My certification supervisor wrote a detailed evaluation, confirming I demonstrated appropriate boundaries between personal experience and professional practice. But Renewal House's decision stood. 6 months before I could reapply, and no guarantee they'd rehire someone whose family had filed complaints about emotional fitness. It's been 5 weeks since Sharon got me fired from Renewal House. We're separated, and I'm living with my sister. Sharon maintains she saved me from work that would have destroyed my mental health. I found volunteer work with a different recovery organization, facilitating virtual support groups for families who've lost loved ones to overdose. It's not the same as the in-person residential work I'd trained for, but it's meaningful. Caleb has started his own therapy and is beginning to understand that my recovery work honors Jake's memory rather than dwelling unhealthily on his death. He attended one of my virtual support groups and heard other parents share stories similar to ours. He said afterward, "I didn't know other families felt this way too." Sharon sent me research about complicated grief and secondary trauma in addiction workers, claiming it proves recovery work is harmful for people who've lost loved ones to overdose. She doesn't understand that helping others navigate what we experienced is healing, not traumatic. The mother who'd requested me at Renewal House found me through the virtual support group. She said her daughter completed 30 days of residential treatment and is now in outpatient care. She thanked me for being available, even though Sharon's complaints had prevented me from being her facility counselor. In 4 months, I can reapply to Renewal House. My certification supervisor says my volunteer work demonstrates continued commitment and will strengthen my reapplication. Some people think I should forgive Sharon since she claims she was protecting my well-being. But protection doesn't justify calling my employer with false allegations that got me fired before my first group session. I'm 45, a certified peer recovery specialist, separated from the wife who sabotaged my addiction recovery career, and helping families through virtual support while waiting to reapply for residential work. Every family I support in the virtual groups proves Sharon wrong. Every parent I help navigate their child's addiction demonstrates that my loss of Jake makes me better at this work, not disqualified from it. The 8 families whose group session I was supposed to facilitate got different support. I'll never know if my presence could have made their journey easier. But Sharon couldn't permanently stop me from turning Jake's death into helping others fight the disease that killed him. She only delayed it by 6 months. That's my revenge. Continuing recovery work despite her interference, proving that losing Jake to addiction gives me insight that helps other families, and being there for parents terrified they'll lose their children the way I lost mine. Jake died alone from fentanyl poisoning. I'm making sure other families have support, resources, and hope that we didn't have. Sharon tried to stop that work. She failed. And in 4 months, I'll be back at Renewal House doing exactly what she claimed I was too damaged to do. Every person I help stay in recovery is proof she was wrong. And that's all the revenge I need.